Please remember that when things get rough, you could always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
And we continue here from Sankofa Video and Books. Greg Carr. This is Introduction to Afro-American Studies. This is our third recorded lecture. For those of you enrolled in the course, Afro 005, Introduction to Afro-American Studies, Carr. Miss you all, but I'm sure you miss each other. Maybe some of y'all miss me, but we're going to continue. For everyone else, welcome into the conversation. Hopefully you got a chance to see the first two videos, and we'll continue now in the third video. Normally, for those of you who are not in this course, we spend 2 weeks on a framing question, which I explained in the previous videos. The framing question for this week, which is the week after spring break here at Howard, and the question which we began the week before spring break, is framing question 4. How did Africans begin to conceptualize unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? We're going to continue now. We ended our last conversation with the conceptual category chart. The conceptual categories have been explained. Howard students, you're all probably sick of hearing them, which would be good because that would mean that you're approaching boredom, which is important. And we know the definition of boredom means you've mastered something so well that you don't really have to think about it too much. A lot of times people say they're bored. What they really mean is they haven't really engaged the material. So I'm hoping you reach the point where you know this by heart. And I know you do because we talk about this in class. But for everyone else, these 6 conceptual categories, as by way of review, are the kind of rudimentary framework that we worked out about 15 years ago to develop the beginning of an Africana Studies methodology. And that methodology is something that we've been working on for a number of years, and it is directly connected to the long arc of work over the last more than 50 years, really, in terms of formal Black studies, Africana studies, however you want to call it. Even Africology is also a term that is used. And that connects to the long arc of Africana intellectual work that precedes those 50 years, stretching back really from antiquity to now. And that may seem very broad for some of you, but if you'd like to read more about the attempt to do that work, I would point you to a couple of sources. One by my old friend and colleague, Nathaniel Norman Jr., who published a book called The Afro-American Studies Reader. That reader, particularly the second edition, very important, Carolina Academic Press, very good compendium. Also Carlene Young and Dolores Aldridge, they published a book, Out of the Furnace, The Development of Africana Studies, and there's an article of mine that I would point you to directly on this topic of disciplinary Africana Studies. It was published in the journal Socialism and Democracy. The article is entitled, What Black Studies Is Not, if you want to understand the sources of this kind of attempt. But at any rate, these 6 conceptual categories: social structure, governance structure, ways of knowing, science and technology, movement and memory, and cultural meaning making. These 6 conceptual categories, we ask questions from each of these categories for each of our framing questions to allow us to answer those questions by asking better questions. That's really the approach the Africana Studies methodology that we're developing really relies on us asking different kind of questions, and out of that beginning to have discussions, debates, arguments, agreements, disagreements, consensus. Sometimes we don't agree, but it gives us a framework. It's really what we're talking about, methodology. We like to reach consensus, but if we don't, we at least know we're coming from a common point of departure. So we apply these conceptual category questions to answer the question, how did African people begin to conceptualize unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries? So let's go to our first category, the social structure category. The social structure category, and those of you who are not in the class, who are watching this, just a point of information, if we were having this class in person, can't replace in-person classes. I'm sorry, you want distance learning, folks. But if we had this class in person, what I normally do is I'm reading things and engaging folks in the world. I will bring that into the class to discuss. So last semester I had begun to read a book and I actually had this one close at hand, so I brought it with me here. Another book again, Sankofa. You all make sure you all are connected to www.sankofa.com and that you're subscribed to Sankofa's YouTube channel. If you're watching this, you probably are subscribed, but if you aren't, you should. Now this is a book called Empires of the Weak. I actually brought this. I had it put in my bag right quick. J.C. Sharman's book, which is very interesting. Sharman is at the University of Cambridge and fellow at King's College. This was published Princeton University Press, came out last year, 2019. And I took a quote from here to help us kind of frame the world, the social structure question, the world that the Africans found themselves in over this last 500 years, with particular focus on the late 19th, mid-19th, early 20th centuries, as we know from the previous class. What was the social structure? Who were Africans to other people? That's the fundamental question in social structure. So when we get to this question of how do Africans begin to conceptualize the unity in thought and action, we need to probably proceed, that question is preceded by another question. What was the social structure? What was the social structure that required them to conceive of themselves beyond their local identities, beyond their local relationships? So Sharman says this near the beginning of the book. He says, what accounts for the rise of the state, the creation of the first global system, and the dominance of the West? Like that phrase, dominance of the West, but you know. John Henry Clark used to always say, the West likes to talk about why it's so great. And in talking about why it's so great, it usually tells on itself. That's why you study European history, or as Arthur Schomburg told him, son, if you want to study African history, you need to understand the history of your master. Understand the European history, and you'll understand where they left you out, and you'll understand why they left you out. So it's important to understand the West. Kind of some of that thinking finds its way into creating that social structure category. So what accounts for the rise of the state, the creation of the first global system, and the dominance of the West? The conventional answer asserts that superior technology, tactics, and institutions formed by Darwinian military competition gave Europeans a decisive advantage in war over other civilizations from 1500 onward. Now, those of you who are a little younger, if you're K-12, particularly high school students who may be watching this is probably how you learned it. The Europeans were just smarter and stronger and more ruthless, and that's why we're having this conversation in English, and it's a great language, isn't it? Anyway, the conventional answer, that's the conventional answer. But empires of the weak, Sharman is arguing that Europeans actually had no general military superiority in the early modern era. J.C. Sharman shows instead that European expansion from the late 15th to the late 18th centuries, in other words, from the late 1400s to the late 1700s, is better explained by deference to strong Asian and African polities, disease in the Americas, and maritime supremacy earned by default because local land-oriented polities were largely indifferent to war and trade at sea. It's actually a very good book. I mean, again, nothing really new in that, and we won't take much time today to break down that last sentence, but I will mention this. We go back, strong Asian and African polities, deference to them by the West. If you did a basic study of the Crusades, the whole spurring of European, what they call the age of exploration, high schoolers in your textbooks, or middle schoolers, even elementary schools, the whole age of exploration, Ferdinand Magellan and Pizarro and Hernando Cortez and, of course, Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus, as we hear his anglicized name. Why are they out there in these boats looking for stuff? Well, part of it is they can't go to what they would be oriented to say is their east. So they go west. And why can't they go east? Well, there are strong Asian and African polities there. There was a strong kind of Africana commingled with Arab culture polity that emerged on the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century. We know, of course, we call them the Moors collectively. There was a book written a decade ago or more called We Are All Moors. The thesis of that book argues that in some ways the rise of quote-unquote Western civilization, we're talking about now the Enlightenment, Renaissance, the rebirth. When was it born? Well, in some ways it's a response. Some people would argue, some of these scholars would argue, and certainly before books like that, you can go back to Bovell, E.W. Bovell, The Golden Age of the Moor, our elder, now ancestor, Ivan Van Sertima, who edited a book called The Golden Age of the Moor, and talk about the fact that the rise of what we now think of as Europe in some ways, and those of you in the class know we covered this in Framing Question 2. How did Africans preserve and affirm their ways of life and use their identities as a means to resist enslavement? It is the response to the occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal, by the Moors, that allows for that kind of formation of the rudiments of what will become a European identity. That's map number 10 in our map book, students, those of you in the Howard class. The expulsion of the Moors from Portugal and Spain, and Portugal's exploration of the African coast, 1393 to 1492. That comes at the end, near the end, the end of the 5-century or so occupation of the Iberian Peninsula by the so-called Moors. Come to think of it, David Levering Lewis wrote a book on that subject, but there's been a lot of books on the subject. But at any rate, that deference to strong Asian and African polities, of course, those polities extend in West Africa. You have strong kingdoms. Probably everybody's heard of the so-called Songhai Empire. Most Africans are not organized at the level. If you look at our levels of human social organization, Howard students, you know, we say level 7 is the modern world system. Level 6 and 5 and 6, which are basically marked by larger amounts of people, realizing that the first level of human social organization is the family. By the time you get to level 5 and 6, you're beyond blood kin. You have common rituals, common totems. You might have a common language, but the networks are knitted together by sometimes a strong military, sometimes strong economic system, common currency, that kind of thing. I'll mention in a minute Fistful of Calories, which is another book I've been reading that we brought into class. But at any rate, Songhai was one of those strong African polities, strong African polities. So the Asian polities, marked largely by Islam in some ways. You think about the Crusades again. To the south, I guess east that would be, but then you go up and over, and you've got everything from the Huns, and of course you got the Chinese in the Far East, so-called Far East, all this oriented to Europe. But that's what's stopping European quote-unquote expansion in that direction. So the age of so-called exploration in some ways is an evasion. You can't just run over these people, so you got to go that way. Some of the old heads out there remember that old song, Istanbul, Constantinople, Istanbul, Constantinople. Like, some people say, what is he talking about? Oh, I'm going to pause, because y'all know if this were a physical class, I'd be looking at the students and they'd realize that you may need to slow down a little bit and get back to exactly what I'm talking about on this framing question. So the social structure we find ourselves facing in this framing question 4 period has been anchored in this notion of European colonial expansion. Cedric Robinson is going to bring this up in his book in a moment. We'll come back to this concept. All right, let's go forward. Of course, we see a physical illustration of the enslavement, which predates framing question 4, but I like to review. Let me get my pointer. It seems to be ready now. Let's see if this thing works. Oh, look at that. So of course, and here's what I'm saying, they can't go this direction, so they go this direction. And some of it is pushing the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula by the end of the 15th century. And so you see these explorers coming down here. If you read Christopher Columbus's journal, he says, man and boy, I sailed the Guinea coast. Or better yet, read Walter Rodney's book, History of the Upper Guinea Coast. And you'll see those things. But at any rate, so they first established trading posts out here, as far south as what we now call Angola, West Central Africa, as far north as Senegal here, right? But here's where the real activity for the Portuguese, you see the so-called Gold Coast, the Akan people, Elmina, Cape Coast, and of course these are labeled castles now, but there's in many ways forts and then administrative centers for these Europeans coming down. And then as they began trading, they're also coming this way. And those of you with the map book know that we talk about those ages of exploration in Unit 1. We won't spend much time on this again. These videos are supposed to be calibrated to the framing question we're at now, not going back and reviewing the entire class. So we won't really get into that a lot. But that's Unit 1, students want to review that. So you see the Africans now being brought out between 1500 and 1870, so to speak, although we know that the enslavement of Africans was formally outlawed in what becomes Brazil in 1888. we see Africans taking off through here. And again, I won't go through all that today. In fact, a very good book that kind of fictionalizes this, but a very important rendering, in fact, by my dear brother Daniel Black. His book, Becoming, the blurb from Charles Johnson, who blurred the book out and shouted the book out. Dan Black, of course, a master teacher, HBCU master teacher at Clark Atlanta University. Very important. But the reason I put this map up now is because when we're asking the question, how did Africans conceive of themselves as a large group? How did Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? The 19th and then 20th century continuation of this project of European settler colonialism that J.C. Sharman is writing about, that our friend Gerald Horne writes about in one of his more recent books, Monthly Review Press, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. And there are many, many other books to mention, but just a couple to give you an idea. Understand that as we enter what Ivan Van Sertima, the aforementioned Dr. Van Sertima, refers to as the 500-year room, roughly speaking from the 15th century forward, there were no Africans and there were no Europeans. Meaning what? These labels don't mean anything. Some people would argue they don't mean anything now. At this point, I would ask my Howard students, we'd all be sitting here, all 240 of us, and I'd be like, now some of y'all from Houston, some of y'all from New York, and your parents are from Nigeria, and so you all have internal conversations about how American you're becoming, but at the same time, they made some people in your families, particularly some of you Yoruba Negroes, don't act like you don't know who I'm talking about, and I'd see a few laughs. They would say, don't you mess around with these Akatas. Some of y'all know what Akata means. You know, I've heard many different translations, and every time I find one of my Yoruba speaking friends or students, or Nigerians broadly, because now it's past the Yoruba community, I would ask them, what does Akata mean? You have all kind of explanations. But one thing is very clear. It does not mean an African, although I think now that the Akata should probably be used for any Europeanized African, wherever you're born. But the whole point is that the idea is the Africans of the diaspora, particularly the Africans of the United States, are to be kind of held at arm's length on some things. Akata, maybe something that's a little wild, like a wild animal, no culture, vacant gaze. Watch those people. They don't have the kind of culture. So when these arguments, these contemporary arguments about cultural appropriation come into conversation, and at this point I would ask the students to say, let's talk about cultural appropriation. People say, what does it mean to be a real African? They see me in my robe, my academic regalia, which I think is absurd, by the way, this monastic tradition. You can go read any number of books about where we wear medieval robes for graduation. But at any rate, I won't get into that today. But we still wearing these monastic robes in May, something the coronavirus seems to have taken care of. So maybe we'll reschedule graduations for August and so forth. But we'll still come out in these robes. So I have a robe that's made of cloth from West Africa, but it's not kente cloth. The way I learned it and the way I observed it in Kumasi, even though tourists come and go and people sell stuff and everybody wears the stuff now, I kind of have a reservation about wearing a lot of kente because, it's a royal cloth. And I don't want to get in conversations about empire and patriarchy and these kind of things, although men are the ones who weave the kente, at least traditionally. I don't like to wear a lot of kente in some ways because I like to at least gesture toward the pre-colonial protocol. And I say all that to say that when a lot of times continental Africans, those born and raised on the continent or directly from the continent, will look at Africans in the diaspora who will wear kente or wear African clothes or, have a dashiki on like me. Dashiki doesn't go back thousands of years. This is a quote-unquote modern kind of style. This one is from Nigeria. And they'll say, look, you're trying to appropriate African culture. But these very same Africans will not wear a lot of African clothing. It's very interesting. First time I went to Ghana in 1996 with the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. We had our conference there. A number of students, we brought a lot of students from Crenshaw High School in LA on the trip, one of these teenagers to come. And we had a 2-day summit with students from Accra, high schools in Accra. So the students from Accra and the students from LA in this conversation about history and culture. It's fascinating. We'll talk about that another time. Anyway, we were in the Ghanaian Senate building for the opening ceremony before we took all the young people and went to, this thing we had created to have this conversation. And all the students from LA, from the United States, stood up and had on African clothes. very happy, very proud to be home, so to speak. Think about my friend Robin Kelly, the book he co-edited, Imagining Home, right? So with Tilden LaMelle. And so, no, not Tilden LaMelle, his brother, Sidney LaMelle. Tilden LaMelle, former president of the University of Columbia, very good friends with John Henry Clark. But Tilden LaMelle and Robin Kelly, Imagining Home. So they're imagining home. They're in these African clothes. And then all the students from Accra who had come were dressed in their best white shirts and ties and dresses. And one group stood up, then the other group stood up. So you got about 30 from one group, 30 from the other group, and they looked at each other, and I'm up front. So I just started laughing, and we talked about that because you wanted to have your best on to meet your family from another place. How do Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries? But at the same time, the orientation was very interesting. At that point, you ask yourself, which of those groups were Africans? Geographically, where they were born, obviously the Ghanaians. But in terms of culture and imagination, both of those groups were African. There's no one way to be African, but the point is that there were no Africans, there were no Europeans, except that this process of enslavement, the coming, created a situation where ultimately the people over here began to conceive of themselves first with the labels that they were forced into: Negro, nigger, black, all these kind of places, mestizo, padrao, moreno, all these labels. But then ultimately this being the source of origin, and this word itself is not of African origin. It comes out of the Latin or the Arabic, depending on which gloss you want to use the label. And there was no one name for all of this because there was no idea about all of this by any of the people who lived in this place. 20% of the world's land mass, the origin of humanity. But the point is that it was over here that this concept of larger identities is formed, and then it kind of back maps into this space. We'll talk about Pan-Africanism. Framing question 5, really, but also framing question 4, because conceiving of unity in thought, as we said in the previous class, pan movements emerge in this. In fact, I think I brought my friend Hakeem Adi's book, which I think is an excellent source. We won't talk about it much today, but if I did put it in my bag, I will shout it out, because those of you who are following along who might want to order this from Sankofa, I would encourage you strongly. Yeah, I did. Because Hakeem did a talk here at Sankofa. Pan-Africanism, a History. Very important book. New book. Hakeem Adi just published this book last spring. Bloomsbury Academic Press, and you can actually order this book at Sankofa. And he came here, and in fact, one of the videos that will be uploaded shortly, or if you're watching this after it's already been uploaded, go and search out Hakeem Adi, A-D-I, good brother, Afro-Brit, written a number of very important books. Go check out his book where we talk about his book, Pan-Africanism. He gives a very important presentation on that. But the pan movements are going to be where this African idea back maps, or to seize on Emmanuel Geis's phrase from his book on Pan-Africanism, the Pan-African idea. I think I called it Pan-Africanism in the previous class. It's called the Pan-African idea. He said kind of boomerang, the boomerang effect. Europe comes here, these people are forced here, and then the boomerang occurs. Some of these ideas infect here. There's a cross-fertilization, Pan-Africanism, and some of the people who are here end up coming back over here in a boomerang effect. And Europe, of course, is a very new book called The Scramble for Europe. It's very interesting, saying that in the next half century or so, there are going to be only less than 500 million people in Western Eurasia that we call Europe, and that there may be that many people in Nigeria, and that the population here is increasingly non-white. So what Geis calls the boomerang effect is not only the ideas of Pan-Africanism boomeranging back here, but the idea and the bodies of African people and others coming back into the so-called, what y'all call them, these students of cultural studies, the metropoles or whatever, the centers and peripheries. Yeah, I never liked that term, because this is always the center in my mind. But I know what you mean. Let's continue. So the social structure question: who are Africans to other people? Labor. And there were no Africans, there were no Europeans. These ideas come into existence. So students in my class anyway, in fact, I'm going to see, can I get this clicker to work? I'm not a real technology guy, but if I can get this clicker to work, I would have it in class. Let me see. My pointer is also a clicker. I don't have a lot of tech, but the tech I have, I kind of enjoy to be able to do it, so I ain't got to. I said, look at that. Look at God. Anyway, or not. Unit 2. Native American slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the political developments in North America and the Caribbean. Map 15, the transatlantic slave trade and European nations enriched by the trade. Those of you not in the class, this will be a review for the students who are. Y'all seen this a million times, students. 1502 to 1888. It's kind of just like another representation of the previous slide, so I'm not going to go into that. This is not framing question 4. The so-called triangle trade, y'all have heard that a million times. Africans coming out of here, resources after they've labored and created stuff going here in addition to goods. And then from here, Europe is being built, and you see some of that stuff brought back here to quote-unquote trade as you're forcing Africans into the largest forced migration in human history. Map 16, the African, he calls it Smallwood, the transatlantic slave trade and the West African kingdoms enriched by the trade, 1500 to 1800. I think that language is a little ham-fisted. People say Africans sold Africans into slavery. I always agree with them and say yes. One more time, Africans, yes. Sold other Africans, yes. So you're already conceptualizing these as the same people, even though they weren't. Into what? Slavery. Okay, no demand, no supply. You need to understand the political economy of enslavement, the social structure of enslavement, before we start blaming each other for things. You know, human being on the planet blameless, but let's be clear. We're talking about systems, not individuals. European in the Western Hemisphere, early 18th century, 1714. We see the territories that people are claiming in the international game equivalent of That's My Car. Most of you young people don't know what that is. We used to ride in cars on long trips, and you be going, I'm from Nashville, go to Alabama for the summer with my grandma and them, and we be going and we looking at cars passing us. That's my car, that's my car. Well, Europe did that with continents, and then went out and tried to reduce those continents to their control. Level 6, we talked about the levels of human social organization. Level 6 systems contest to influence the emerging Level 7 system. Level 7 meaning the modern world system. 18th century West Atlantic networks and interaction spheres. So 1755, you see Louisiana, largely French. This is Spanish. They're trying to claim New Spain, New Mexico, whatever you want to say. English colonies, just a little on the east, on the seaboard here, and there's a few things down here. But 1763, you've got, about 30 years wartime, or so-called French and Indian War in the Western Hemisphere. You see Louisiana, here again, New Mexico, the English colonies, and they're trying to move this way. Students in the Howard class, we talked about George Washington being sent out to the Ohio Valley to put the French out of the Ohio Valley around Fort Duquesne, what is now near Pittsburgh, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, by the time they get back to the East Coast, the English want them to help pay for the French and Indian War. No taxation without representation. We're not going backward. Maybe I'll do a few videos on those earlier framing questions if those of you who watch this on the Sankofa channel and who are not in the class are interested. And we can go into that in great detail. But I don't want to get too far afield this morning, this afternoon, or tonight when you're watching. This, again, to recenter for a moment, as I get my coffee. Introduction to African Studies, framing question 4. How did Africans begin to conceive of themselves by ways of unity of thought and action in the face of European and American imperialism? Just a little bit more background. One of our texts to answer this framing question, which so far in this conversation we've been giving a little background to in terms of the social structure question. How did what social structures did Africans find themselves in that required them to think of themselves as being connected, not only conceptually as like being similar people, but politically in terms of forming resistance to the oppression they found themselves in. And that's the modern world system. The modern world system that we're talking about to this moment is really about the settler colonialism of Europe that forced Africans into this oppositional stance that kind of undergirds much of the thrust of what becomes the common cultural kind of political uses of culture. We talk about culture when we get to another category, ways of knowing, cultural meaning making and movement and memory. But let's go to Cedric Robinson, Black Movements in America, one of our anchor texts, chapter 5. The Ndir and its aftermath. Ndir, students, is a term coined by the great Howard University professor, history professor, Rayford Logan, Rayford Whittingham Logan. Rayford Logan, who coined that term, he used the term, became the title of a book that he wrote, a little bit after the turn of the century, The Ndir, American Negro Life and Thought. The Ndir, the dark point of African history or after the African experience in America. It's also known by another name in another edition. It's called The Betrayal of the Negro. Rayford Logan, Ndir means the dark point, the lowest point, the darkest moment. I hate to use that dark phrase, but you know, it is what it is. Logan identifies that period in American history and the African experience of it with the election of 1876, the Hayes-Tilden election. The election, he goes from 1877 to 1901. He said that's the dark period. That's the period when the Reconstruction governments are blown out in the South, where this creeping intimidation of black voters, kind of like what we're seeing today, it hadn't gotten quite that bad yet, but hold on, Sam and Dave would say, I'm coming, these white supremacists might say. But you see voter intimidation, the erosion of the governments in the U.S. South. So the intimidation of black voters in Louisiana. Some of y'all look up United States versus Cruikshank. You want to look at some of this stuff. North Carolina, by the time you get to 1898, 1899, the so-called Wilmington Terror riot of 1898, 1899, the white people just decide in Wilmington, North Carolina, they're just going to take over the government again. So they start murdering black people. There's a new book called Wilmington's Lie that talks about that. But the first book I read on the subject was by another great black college teacher, largely unknown today. In fact, I was mentioning it with my friend Ibram Kendi. We did something on the 150th anniversary of Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, and he and I were sitting in the cafe at the bookstore we did it at here in D.C., and somebody mentioned the Wilmington riot. I said, have you ever read H. Leon Prather? H. Leon Prather was a professor of history at Tennessee A&I State College for Negroes, now Tennessee State University. I had him for a history class as a freshman at Tennessee State. And he had just finished his manuscript. He was bragging about his book, We Have Taken a City. That was a book on the Wilmington race terror unleashed by white supremacists, the so-called Wilmington Race Riot, 1898. And there are a couple of books been written since, but Prather's book should never not be mentioned. First thing I did when I bought Wilmington's Lie was go to the bibliography. Scholars, pro tip, students rather, I'm talking about my students now. When you get an academic book, if you know something about the subject, go to the bibliography, go to the footnotes, and if there's certain books they don't mention, they miss the spot. And a lot of those books that don't make their way, a lot of those conversations or papers or presentations that don't make their way into these academic books, unfortunately, there's a gold mine in the HBCU scholars who labored and trained generations, but who don't often get cited. H. Leon Prather is one of those cats. The Wilmington riot. So that happened during this period Rayford Logan calls the Ndir. The Ndir is the dark point. Framing question 4, how did Africans begin to conceive of themselves in unity of thought and action? How did Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? Part of the answer to that question is that they began to connect through improved systems of communication. And in that connection, they became aware of how they were fighting in different places. But part of the reason that they had to fight was the social structure they found themselves in, which continued to oppress them after enslavement, and that morphed into debt peonage, voter suppression, the denial of land, and then economic power and political power in the Western Hemisphere, focusing here in the United States, and in Africa, the attempt to take the land directly and the natural resources of Africa, which we'll get into, which is one of the reasons why we're reading Wole Soyinka's book of Africa. Again, in this class, he opens with that. So, the Ndir and its aftermath, chapter 5, one of the chapters that we are reading in answering framing question 4, students. Let's begin. Y'all can't see that. I just put it up here so you could have a context for the social structure. This is directly from Cedric Robinson. Social structure. We're still in framing question. We're framing question 4, still in the first conceptual category. Social structure. In the long, violent, and increasingly oppressive era that followed the Civil War and the failed Reconstruction, land, or more particularly the appropriation of land, marred, thwarted, and maimed the promise of a democratic American social contract. This sentence right here, my man wrote this hell out of this sentence. I'm going to read it one time straight. The land taken from the Native American, the land refused the former slaves and the poor whites, the land withheld from the poor immigrants from Asia, Europe, and Central America, formed the politics of the Republic into a stark social war between the super rich and the grubbing poor. Those of you who are W.B. Du Bois fans, can't y'all hear Du Bois's fingerprints all over that? Said Robinson. I love it. This horrid contest between the new and the many were made even more reprehensible in the general opinion because of its contrast with the democratic rhetoric of the founding fathers. Then he goes on to get into this whole analysis. In fact, I'll just read the rest of the paragraph for you. Perhaps a general understanding of the ancient site of democratic politics, Greece, might have proven sufficiently instructive to temper the class war. But greed has no natural or genetic links with historical memory. It is commanded by the immediate moment. The founding American Republic, which had borrowed from Athens its rhetoric, but not its institutions, now seemed destined to replicate Athens' self-subversion. Then he goes into this whole analysis of Athenian democracy and how the demands of impoverished and enslaved Athenians for the redistribution of land were not met, which undermines the whole project of Greece, even as Demosthenes and Solon and them are talking about the greatness of Athenian democracy and debate. They're not redistributing land. They're not redistributing resources. Sound familiar? So ultimately, this whole project going to be undermined, going to be weakened by the fact that everybody doesn't get something, a basic floor. Whole lot of ways we could go with that, y'all. If any of you all are law students or lawyers or legal scholars, I would refer to you a book written by the current dean of the University of Virginia Law School, Risa Goluboff, The Lost Promise of Civil Rights, where you see Charles Hamilton Houston and them debating this stuff in the 1930s and 40s. Or for those of you with some time on your hands who's sitting at home, why don't y'all page through the digitized records of the Journal of Negro Education and look at these HBCU scholars who are talking about the value of land redistribution and how class war is going to be a problem. Everybody from Ralph Bunche and Charlie Houston to many others. But at any rate, Robinson's point is that it is the disconnection from land. Go back to that previous class. We were talking about Catherine Frankie's book, Repair, which kind of makes this argument as well brilliantly. When people don't have land, but human beings are always going to have a sense of place. There's also a sense that I don't own even the ground I stand on. Land and place, two different things. They can commingle, but your place may not be a place that you completely own or control. And land is at the center of settler colonialism, this Western concept. In fact, it is the basis in many ways of the American legal universe. If you look at the history of how law deals with this, is land and the relationship between actors who are coming out of the ownership of that real property. You got personal property like Africans, a whole nother conversation. But the social structure that we're talking about, the context, in fact, for or of European-oriented colonialism and imperialism, the last part of that question, framing question 4, what's the context? What's the social structure for it? Well, the concept of property, land and people, ownership and dispossession. Y'all know the first dispossession, of course, was to our Native American kin, which is why when my friends and colleagues say that slavery is America's original sin, I cringe. You forgetting about our blood kin, the Native Americans, the First Nations people, the people who, if you look at the Smithsonian's exhibit, when it reopens, I encourage everyone, if you're in D.C., to go see the Smithsonian Museum's exhibit. I love the Museum of the American Indian. On the second floor, I guess it is called Americans. So when you go up there, one of the first things you see is they say, when Europeans came here, they called these people Americans. They weren't Native Americans. Native American come later, after you now dispossess them of a concept of ownership and you insert yourself as the center of this universe and say, I am an American. Now you predate me, so you're Native American. No, they were just Americans, meaning what? You gave them a label too. But it's based on this concept of property, land, real title, terris nullis, or whatever, the Latin phrase is for this my shit. But I was here. Yeah, but you don't have a concept of ownership. I do. Therefore, it's mine. Wow, that's my car. That's my continent. And then people. Yeah, y'all know, La Casas, and, Columbus, we're going to enslave these people to work for us, and they start dying. We done made them sick. Yeah, this coronavirus, this ain't the first virus. And some of this stuff was loosed on people by Europeans. Everything from smallpox and syphilis, but, talk about that. It's part of that Columbian exchange, so to speak. Some of y'all know what that is. Ownership and dispossession. This concept is framing the social structure out of which Africans will have to imagine a community, imagine a place, imagine a home, ultimately begin to think of each other beyond these artificial lines that were drawn by this moment of settler colonialism. How did Africans begin to conceive of unity and thought beyond national boundaries, beyond state boundaries, really, in the face of European and American imperialism, in the face of this social structure, transcending those artificial lines, thinking of each other beyond lines that were drawn in a moment of settler colonialism, leading right up to, as Deontay Wilder would say, to this day. We think of each other beyond the national boundaries. You ever want a great example of that? Just watch American Negroes, who they cheer for in the Olympics. If they black and wearing the colors and nobody else in the lane is, we're going to cheer for the black person. The flag is incidental. They can say what they want on the interviews when you survey them, but I've been around too many black people cheering for Cuba and Jamaica, cheering for Nigeria. Now, come on now. All right, let's keep going. Concept of identity formation, which is really what I'm talking about. Identity and status is connected to ownership. So it's very interesting. There are many types of ownership, right? There's the ownership of something material, my car, my house, my computer. And then there's ownership of something that's immaterial, my culture. Everybody said, for the culture, right? Or in the words of that great Senegalese American, if we go through her daddy's side, Issa Rae, I'm cheering for everybody black. I'm rooting for everybody black. Meaning what? I'm black, you black. The concept of ownership transcends material ownership, but in the Western concept of identity formation, identity and status is connected to material ownership. White men, rich white men, right? Was it William Layman that edited the book Jumpin' Jim Crow with all the different song lyrics from the so-called antebellum period here in the United States? And one of the songs that was attested to have been sung by black people, my name is Dan, it's a black guy. My name is Dan, I work in the sand, I'd rather be a nigger than a poor white man. What does that mean? That means that it's worse to be a poor white man in some contexts. Why? Because enslavement is a terrible condition. I want to end it. It's always worse. But immaterially, you're white and poor. What's your excuse? Well, it's based on this concept of identity formation. Identity and status is connected to ownership. You don't own nothing. I'm prevented from owning. You are not. Except you kind of are, but that's, a little bit beyond this for today. Because the creation of whiteness becomes the marker of status, you see. That poor white man can say, in the words of James Baldwin, I am not, thank heaven, you. Meaning what? Yeah, you might have a little money, Sarah Breedlove or Madam C.J. Walker. Yeah, you might have some, Booker T. Washington. If y'all read a little article in the Journal of Negro History called Booker T. Washington and the Ulrich Affair. Booker Washington in New York accused of trying to peep on white women in this low-rent district in San Juan Hills section of Manhattan. And a white man named Henry Ulrich beats him up with a cane and accuses him of being a reprobate for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What is that? This is Booker T. Washington. Yes, but you're black. And I am better than you. It doesn't matter. I can do this to any black person. The creation of whiteness becomes a marker for status. As Gerald Horne likes to say, whiteness becomes the battle pay that this tiny white elite extend to the rest of the white people to create a buffer between whiteness and non-whiteness. It's one of the things that erodes the attempts to create unity, whether it be the farmers of the late 19th century. Back to that Rayford Logan Ndir period. Poor white farmers, poor black farmers need to get together. Let's create some, some populism. Let's boost it. We're gonna say we're going to be white first. Read about Tom Watson and the agrarian movement, and then phrases like this election will be won by the person that yells nigger the loudest, the bloody shirt. In other words, if you yell whiteness, the poor whites will cleave to the race before they will build solidarity based on class. You see some of that stuff today. MAGA folks who may have strayed onto this channel, stick around. We might deprogram y'all. I don't know. You deprogram yourself. I don't believe in pushing ideology. I believe in study, deep study. You need to make up your own mind, but you got to study first. The creation of whiteness becomes a marker for status. And then you have the slow creation of shades of whiteness, and the Negro becomes anti-citizen. You want to read a good book on that? Nikhil Pal Singh's book, Black as a Country. Taught that book many times in class. The whole idea that the Negro becomes the anti-citizen, because one of the gold standard for identity, political identity, in these artificial constructs called states, the gold standard in these artificial constructs that we call states now, in this modern system, the modern world system, the Western-oriented system, the gold standard for political identity is the C word, citizenship. Very important to linger on that for a second. How do you become a citizen? As if being a citizen makes you a higher level of human than a non-citizen, which is why this whole conversation that we have about rights in these societies, you know, anytime you start that conversation with talking about citizenship, you've already diminished the humanity of people who should have the same thing as everybody else at a basic level. But citizenship becomes this standard. So you read Nikhil Singh, he walk you through that, right? So at any rate, the Negro becomes the anti-citizen. It's not possible for the Negro to be a full citizen. But as the Negro tries to fight his way into citizenship, and then whiteness begins to concede some incremental victories, by the time we get to the mid-20th century forward, a lot of those concessions are anchored, when you read the work of Carol Anderson, Gerald Horne, so many others, a lot of those concessions are anchored in the fear that Africans will conceive of unity in thought beyond national boundaries in the face of this American oppression. In other words, Africans like Eslanda Good Robeson and her husband Paul Robeson, Africans like Addie Hunton and her husband Alphaeus Hunton, Africans like the Pattersons, Louise Thompson Patterson, her husband William Patterson, lawyer. Africans like Shirley Graham Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois will make connections to Africans and others outside of America. So the citizenship connection in America is, if you abandon that kind of radical transcending American identity and citizenship as the gold standard to build connections to other people, if you abandon that as your primary project, NAACP, Roy Wilkins, whoever you want, Gloucester Current, Walter White, whoever, and turn inward and continue to talk to us, meaning the United States, dangling citizenship as a possibility, we will make some concessions. Brown versus Board of Education. We will make some concessions, Little Rock 9. And they will be steep because we're going to unsettle the whites who don't have a lot except whiteness, which they have tied to citizenship in this bizarre way. But we will side with you as long as you don't go outside of these imaginary lines. Which also means you got to sell out the Du Boises, the Robesons, the Pattersons, the Huntons, right? Read Stephen Carter's book about, I guess it's his great aunt, where he talks about his great aunt was a lawyer, and part of it was they painted her brother, Alphaeus Hunton, as a communist. So he kind of had to turn from that. And she actually became a very important lawyer in New York, working against the mob. The name of the book escapes me by the next lecture. It might come to me before we stop for today. But my point is that as Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries, there's a strengthening in the social structure of an attempt to peel off that black elite to keep the struggle of black people local and to make it a struggle for citizenship, which is the gold standard of political identity in these nation states, and ultimately still orients those Africans in those states to whiteness as a marker for status and the slow creation of shades of whiteness. Because as long as the Negro is an anti-citizen, the Negro will fight their way into citizenship. And if you're fighting your way into citizenship, it informs everything. It informs the way you view freedom. It informs the way you look at African culture. Look at the 1619 Project, which I think is very valuable. Also raises again that specter. Anytime you're anchoring the aspirations of African people in any European settler colony to the gold standard of that settler colony, you've diminished the African dimension. And This reaches back to Ralph Bunche in the pages of the Journal of Negro Education, where he's actually doing a critique of this, and he's saying the black elites may eventually peel off because they can negotiate a little space to operate. You read Adolph Reed's critique of the 1619 Project, whatever else you think about Adolph Reed Jr. and any rest of it, one of the things he says intrigued me. He said in a sentence, one of the sentences, he says, what if the black elite really aren't trying to upset or reconfigure the entire political economy of the United States? And I don't think that this is Nicole Hannah-Jones' project at all, particularly because she spent a lot of time now dealing with reparations. Good sister is doing a lot of study about that. I think reparations may be her ultimate goal, which I'm all there for it. But Reed's critique is maybe some of these other people are not really about reconfiguring the political economy. Maybe all they're saying is, we're not against the 1% running everything. We just want 12% of the 1% to be black. What? Yeah, so all this thing, Rosa sat so Martin could walk, so so-and-so could, so Obama could fly. Yeah, take them t-shirts off. Because the idea of individual black elected officials being the gold standard was never the objective of this. This is about social transformation, which will help everyone, but ultimately the Africans do that. What Cedric Robinson really is talking about when he gets into chapter 4, chapter 5 of this book, the local struggle is for the transformation of the society, and that kind of work overflows the imaginary boundaries of any particular state. It is the trade union movement in West Africa. You read literature like Mariam Abba's book, So Long a Letter, in West Africa, Senegal, right? Look at what's going on in Brazil, Dos Nascimento and all them with the black consciousness movement in Brazil. Look at the Africans of the Caribbean. They're overflowing their particular place and trying to connect to each other in this broader human struggle. What Malcolm would say is the struggle for human rights rather than civil rights. What Martin would agree with. Certainly, as early as 1957, when he and Coretta go to Ghana for the installment of Kwame Nkrumah as the Prime Minister of Africa, and Martin King talks about this idea, our home being in Africa. Very important. But the creation of whiteness is a marker for status. In fact, pause. This slide again. Framing question 4. How did Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? They are facing a social structure where settler colonialism, the context is, settler colonialism has created a concept of property, land and people, ownership and dispossession. You come in, you move people out, now this is mine. Concept of identity formation, identity and status connected to ownership. So you create this class status in the West, and it's a lot more complicated, a lot more detailed than this, but I'm just going very quickly. And you create whiteness as the marker for status, and the slow creation of shades of whiteness and the Negro as anti-citizen. So now you orient black people to fight for their rights in these specific places they find themselves, rather than to connect to each other beyond those state boundaries. And that's a struggle to make them do that. That goes back to the first kidnapped Africans, first enslaved Africans, because you see that during enslavement. You see that with the fear of the results of the Haitian Revolution and that idea spreading. One final thing, if I was in class physically, I'd tell these students this story, so I'm going to tell everybody on the video. I came up with this term, shades of whiteness. I'm not really good on first person pronouns, but I will say this one. I came up with this phrase when I was working for the School District of Philadelphia. This is around 1999. Every year, the School District of Philadelphia, at that time the 5th largest school district in the country, used to have an equity conference. I think this was the idea of David Hornbeck, very interesting, brilliant educator who was superintendent of schools at the time. And the guy that kind of forced Philadelphia Freedom Schools into existence. And I'm grateful because we're still going strong in our 21st year. We used to have a conference, an equity conference, and the name of that conference was All Means All, meaning anything that happens for the best students and the richest students in this school district should happen for the poorest, for the ones who have the least resources. And so they had tracks, categories, race, differently abled people, everything, right? Gender. And so we had a planning meeting for the All Means All conference that was coming up. And, I was working for the School District of Philadelphia. They couldn't really figure out a title for me, so they had me make up a title. So my title was Specialist on Race and Culture. I got to do a lot of important work. I love those people in the school district to this day, particularly these black women who really looked out for me, Cassandra Watson Jones, so many others. Anyway, So I was, I did a lot of different kind of things. One of the things I helped was we're going to plan this all means all conference. So they got to the different categories. Then they had a category called ethnicity. They said, who's going to take the lead in organizing the ethnicity conference? Because all the principals, many of the students, teachers, everybody had to come to this conference. Big conference every year. Dr. Carr, would you like to take a stab? I sure would. So when we opened the conference, the conversation that I used to frame the ethnicity track, ethnicity, ethne, from the Greek, meaning other. Other than what? Well, for the Greeks, other than Greeks. For the Romans, other than Romans. For the Christians, other than Christians. Root of the word heathen. In other words, other than whoever I define myself as. I said, you know what? Maybe we should stop calling this conference the All Means All Conference and call it the All Means Y'all Conference. What does that mean? Because this whole conference doesn't articulate the one identity that makes these other ethnic identities necessary. What identity is that? Whiteness. So I renamed that track, instead of ethnicity, it's called as Shades of Whiteness. Because once you establish whiteness as the normative standard for identity, everybody trying to fight their way into whiteness. If not physically fighting their way in, some of y'all know what I'm talking about this, I want to have a baby with so-and-so, or I want to do, wow. Why do you want to do that? Because the perception of whiteness as normative in terms of beauty becomes real problematic. Read the good brother, my friend Clyde Taylor's book, The Mask of Art, which is a brilliant piece about this whole question of the invisibility of whiteness and the reason that makes it so powerful. Physically, conceptually, culturally, you gotta speak a certain way, dress a certain way, move a certain way through time and space. Why? Because the ways that you identify with power, the ways that you create as markers for status, become ways that you also associate with whiteness. Slow creation of shades of whiteness in the Negro as anti-citizen. Part of seeing each other beyond state boundaries, beyond these national boundaries, beyond these imaginary lines, was that this Pan-Africanism, this idea of connection in many ways, allowed Africans to reaffirm standards that displace whiteness as the normative standard for humanity, that destabilize the concept of identity formation connected with physical ownership in any place. That's that Garvey flag we talked about in the previous lecture, and that ultimately lead to the demand for property, to cease being dispossessed everywhere and to connect dispossession one place with dispossession another place, which is why when Martin and Coretta King were in Ghana and the Eisenhower administration in the United States was in power, Eisenhower didn't go to Ghana, but he sent Richard Nixon, and there's a famous picture of Nixon and Dr. King talking to each other in their tuxedos at one of the receptions in Ghana. And one of the things King brings up in that conversation is, when we get back to the United States, I want to sit down and talk to you about this stuff that's going on down in the South. This shakes Dick Nixon. What? Yeah, because we're in Ghana at the invitation of my cousin, Kwame Nkrumah. I don't mean blood cousin. I mean conceptual, beyond national boundaries cousin. And Nixon, representing America, United States government, comes back and is like, yo, we got to really think this through. Why these Negroes over here talking to other Negroes who aren't under our flag? That's not the first time. Go back to Martin Delany, 1859, after him and Robert Campbell go to what is now Nigeria, and Delany stops off in England because he's a member of the Explorer Club, and he runs into a representative from the James Buchanan presidential administration. Buchanan, of course, is the president before, I guess it was Buchanan, Franklin Pierce, then, Pierce, Buchanan, then Abraham Lincoln. So you got a problem. Why? Delany running around the world talking about Africans, and the Buchanan administration, like, ain't he an American Negro? Yes, but what is he doing over here? Delany's like, yeah, I was born in America, but shit, America wasn't born in me. I'm a citizen of the world. Very important. Conceiving of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries. Let's continue. By way of review, my Howard students, y'all know how I do this. Everybody else, hang with me for about 10 minutes. I ain't gonna spend a whole lot of time on this. These are the chapters of Cedric Robinson before we get to chapters 4 and 5. If you want too fast, pause the video. Chapter 1, The Coming to America. That's my friend Gerald Horne's book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Those of you who read the 1619 Project, y'all know that in phase 2, as they move forward, Gerald has been recruited more actively to participate in that conversation, because a lot of the work in the 1619 Project gestures toward work that he had been doing and historians and scholars before him have been doing. And, in the magazine that the New York Times published, the 1619 Project, one of my favorite pieces in the magazine was the poem by the great poet Tayemba Jess. Tayemba Jess's poem, brother's poem there in the magazine, to me, captured the spirit of the African. It's a poem on maroonage. Look it up for yourself. And in terms of the Africana Studies methodology, stick that in the cultural meaning making and in the ways of knowing categories. How do Africans conceive the world? And that's ways of knowing. And in cultural meaning making, in any given point of time, how do they mark that moment in time? You can even put it also in movement and memory. How do they remember this experience? Tayemba Jess did a good job, brother. But this whole notion of resistance is transcending national boundaries. Cedric Robinson is talking about that in chapter 1, where he talks about blacks in colonial English America, where the colonies came from and how the black people found themselves in them. The 1619 Project focuses on British North America, but we understand that there was Spanish North America and French North America and Dutch North America, New Amsterdam, now known as New York. Some of that stuff predates 1619 by as much as almost a century. Estevanico, Little Stephen, the Spanish, right? I know y'all heard them. Some of y'all elementary school students had to read about Estevanico. The early black movements of resistance. Black people started resistance the first time somebody put their hands on them in Africa. And usually that was somebody that looked like them. Ain't nobody trying to just leave their house like this game of tag. You're it. Oh, guess I go into slavery. Hell no. Black people resisted. That's at the core of any good curriculum. Those of you writing curriculum, worry about homeschooling. You want to study black people? Don't start with the ass whippings. Start with the resistance. In fact, my mom was from real close to where Brother Brian Stevenson and the group from EJIs put that monument down in that museum down there in Alabama. And, I was down in Selma a couple of weeks ago. And my thing is, the names of the Africans who were lynched, who were tortured, who were murdered, yes, we need to remember all those names. I also want to see the names of the white people that they killed or beat or maimed to get the hell out and the places they went. Because the monuments, movement and memory, the monuments, cultural meaning making, the monuments enforce ways of knowing that can often have us sit in the trauma, and we must sit in the trauma to transcend it. But if we start our identities with the trauma, we got a problem. The trauma must be enveloped in a broader arc of concept of humanity. It can't always be about the ass whippings, because yes, they show resistance. Yes, they show we've transcended. But if you start with the trauma, what does that say about the concept of the African self? So the early black movements of resistance that Robinson is talking about, very important in here. Maroonage in North America. We talked about that as well. This is a review. Diverging political cultures. This is where you want to go. By the time you get to framing question 4, you see these tensions between the black elite, who are negotiating in many ways based on where we find ourselves in these nation states, petitions, movements to vote, movements to own property, all very important, all essential. But what Cedric Robinson talks about in this chapter 1, which he then comes back to in chapters 4 and 5, is that the vast majority of African people are fighting a more stark fight because they're facing a more stark reality, the physical, brutal oppression of enslavement. And so the cultures begin to diverge. The masses of African people, and I use that word advisedly, I know there's no one group identity, but the people who are suffering in those larger numbers, in those kind of larger contexts of oppression, begin to develop a solidarity that's based in part on survival and resistance to that immediate oppression. More on that in a moment. Chapter 2, Slavery and the Constitution. This is Alan Taylor's book, The Internal Enemy. Won a lot of awards, including the National Book Award finalist, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832. The reason I put that there and put it after Gerald Horne's book is because what Horne is writing about here, Taylor is writing about here. Taylor came to campus and gave a talk, and I asked him a question about this, in part because, Taylor's book is very important work. But often when you see the formal recognition of scholarship, and I'm talking about written scholarship, I ain't talking about the vast majority of scholarship, which never makes its way into books, which is likely mouth to ear and apprentice scholarship. But that sliver of it that finds its way into books is often created. There's a hierarchy that's created there in terms of who to read and who not to read, who to study, who not to study. It's very important. That's maybe I'll make a whole nother video just on that. Be another conversation we have. But Taylor's work is important, but I would say if you got to pick between Taylor and Horne, read Horne first. All right, Taylor. Yes, Nat Turner rebellion, right? Fear, again, transcended. There are 3 American revolutions according to Cedric Robinson. You got the white elites versus the colonial elites versus the British elites. That's George III and them versus George Washington and them. That's the one we learn in school, as if we were all in that. But John Adams said a third of the people didn't care, white people, and a third of the people were against the revolution. Very important to understand. Documenting indifference and interest. That's where Robinson writes about what Adams and them are talking about. And John Adams is a funny dude. Second president of the United States, Massachusetts, we give, we, meaning this imaginary American people, yeah, John Adams is our man. Really? John Adams was one of the lawyers who defended the police for killing Crispus Attucks and his friends. And by the police, I mean the British soldiers. But they weren't known as just British soldiers then. They were the law when they shot them boys in 1775 in Boston. He said, in fact, what did Adams say? Well, they only shot a bunch of jack tars, saucy boys, and Negroes. In other words, poor whites and the blacks. And who cares? Crispus Attucks. The slaves revolution continues. Africans are going to work with whoever's going to help them to get out of enslavement. In Boston Harbor, Attucks, who's in his 6th decade of life by that time, no, 5th decade, in his 50s. Attucks is working with these white dudes, these guys he works on the ships with, right? Boston always been an international city since it's set up as a colonial outpost, right? A lot of Africans in Boston then and now, I'm a baseball fan. A lot of Dominicans in Boston. That's when Pedro Martinez and Big Papi and them cats playing for the Red Sox, racist franchise that they are. You got a lot of Africans who cheered for them, the African Caribbean folk. But that goes back to Prince Hall, who's from Barbados in the 1770s. So very important. His son, Primus Hall, who started a school for black people in Boston in 1820. Go look at Roberts versus Boston. Very important because the black people are being mistreated in the schools in Boston. And some of them black people came from the Caribbean. So, but the slaves revolution means that if you're in Boston, you're combining with poor whites or other blacks to try to fight oppression. If you're in the Caribbean, you're in that ungovernable Caribbean we talked about in the previous class. You're trying to connect with whoever will help you, which might look like some of them buccaneers and privateers that, they glossed on to Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean. If you're in Brazil, you might have maroonage where you go and make palmares, where you deal with this question of big places where you have maroons. At any rate, or if you are in the American South, you might find yourself with other Africans, different places, and you create a different type of glossed identity. Go read the great Michael A. Gomez's book, Exchanging Our Country Marks, where he talks about this and then begins to break it down by these ethnicities. And of course, you tug on Mike Gomez and everybody else falls out, beginning with Sterling Stuckey in some ways and continuing through Winland Midlow Hall, so many others who have written about this, too many to name at this point. So let's review. The U.S. moves from settler colonies to a racialized nation state. We're going to go through this fairly quickly. We've been going now for almost an hour. I think we might take it a little bit longer because one thing with distance learning, you can always pause. But some of you Negroes are going to go stir crazy, so we might as well be doing this, and y'all can be taking notes and buying some of these books from Sankofa, and let's jailbreak the black university. And for those of you who want to know what happens at a black university, imagine in a real world, physical world, where we're having this conversation, and it's not just me talking, it's me being able to stop every few minutes and invite into the conversation questions and comments from African children from all over the world who have been freed from the concept that they are the exceptional one in the class because they're black, where their blackness is not even the consideration. Their specific identity is the one that we want to draw out and commingle with the study, the conversations. Insane. I miss you guys. I can't wait to get you back because that's what gives me life and sends me back to these books for answers. The early settler colonial period, 1500s to the 1770s. Spain had Florida and California, France, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Ohio valleys. This stuff we already covered. England had the Eastern Seaboard. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, very good. Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. As I said, these people were here. Come on now. This is a very interesting book. Karen Kupperman has published a transcript of this young cat who, now we're talking about so-called Pocahontas. Throw that Disney stuff away. I know y'all watching Disney because you're desperate now. Your children want to see Pocahontas. No, there's a young white boy who learns the language of Pocahontas and, the Africans who are there and becomes a translator. What's his name? Henry Spillman. A little tiny book. It's one of the many books. I can't just tote around all the books with me. But what you read is you get a sense of that early politics in Virginia. Now that's a 1619 project. Interesting thing, I would think. The three American revolutions, we talked about this as well. The poor against the wealthy. That was the one that I didn't mention. I only mention one. The elites versus the elites. The revolution of the poor colonists against the wealthy. Now that's everything from, Shays Rebellion. Y'all know poor white people ain't got nothing, so they fighting too. Read Toni Morrison's novel, Mercy. Kind of leads you through that in an intriguing way. Miss Morrison, as she always was, brilliant scholar, brilliant artist and writer, kind of commingles these things. You see how these identities tease apart and then form together. And much of it is poor whites trying to figure out how to negotiate for room to operate dealing with the wealthy. The revolution of the colonial elites against the British monarchy. This is the one in terms of that conceptual category. We thought about it in terms of a European context. Movement and memory. How do we remember this experience? This is the category that we usually taught in school. So you got Negroes identifying with the Pilgrims, identifying with, I'm not throwing away my shot. I'll save that shade for another day. Shout out to Lin-Manuel Miranda. At any rate, and then the War of the Blacks. The War of the Blacks means we fighting and we're going to fight with each other, and then we're going to fight against you, and whoever come with us, come with us. This is the origin of the Seminoles. Robinson talks about that brilliantly. There's Gerald Horne's book again. There's Gerald Horne's book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans and the British Empire fight the United States before emancipation. Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in Canada under the Union Jack, saying if you get here, we'll help you. Who are you talking to? These Africans who were enslaved other places. Why trust the United States? I mean, all the scholarship on it. I mean, here's an interesting book, Allen Gilbert's book, Black Patriots and Loyalists, Fighting for Emancipation in the War of Independence. But what Robinson reminds us of is that as many Africans fought against George Washington's armies as fought for him. I mean, formally, Lord Dunmore, 1775, Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia, the colonial governor of Virginia. At least 5,000 fought for the British. So it's, 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. Or rather yet, 5 in one hand, 5 in the other, in terms of who fought for who. And then in Virginia alone, there's some estimates that as many as 30,000 ran away. They shooting. Made you look. I'm out. These are Africans who are running. Alan Taylor's book again, The Eternal Enemy, Slavery and the War in Virginia. Governance. So the first question we ask, social structure, who are Africans to other people? We see these Africans find themselves in a settler colonial formation where oppression is dictating how they respond to it, and they're exchanging their country marks. They are fighting the counter-revolution, and by counter-revolution meaning that, Gerald would argue that the British are talking about possibly having emancipation for enslaved Africans, and maybe using the enslaved Africans of the colonies to keep George Washington and them in line. So the American Revolution in some ways becomes also a counter-revolution. We're trying to get away from England in case they're wavering on enslavement, and that's one of the factors. And that's where a lot of this argument is going out between our friends who are writing in the 1619 Project and the critics of the 1619 Project who are saying, nah, that ain't the real reason, and there's a whole backdrop of criticism of the scholarship of the 1619 Project. We're not here to get into that, but the political formation that's really pushing that critique ain't about trying to get stories right, trying to get stuff factually accurate. Is trying to preserve this movement and memory that has a certain formation of the idea of American exceptionalism. And so this is being unsettled in some quarters by the 1619 Project. So keep up the good work. But we're going to move now from the social structure, which is of less interest to me. I believe in... I should stop. I'm not going to say that. Let's keep on. To the governance structure. Who are Africans to each other? This is another very interesting book. Toby Green's new book. Another one came out in 2019. A Fistful of Shells. West Africa from the rise of the slave trade to the age of revolution. Who are these Africans to each other? Who are the people who get on the boat, and how does that inform how they see each other? Right? Because they weren't just sitting there waiting to become slaves. Popular culture notwithstanding. What Toby Green writes, by the time of the so-called scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, framing question 4, how did Africans preserve unity in thought, conceive of unity in thought beyond national boundaries, beyond state boundaries, in the face of European and American imperialism? Remember, by the time we get to the so-called scramble for Africa, Howard students, and that's when you go in your map book and you look at Unit 6. No, actually it's Unit, it's Unit 6. Unit 6, Map 85, the partitioning of Africa, Africa before and after 1880. While America dealt with the Civil War, the Indian Wars, the collapse of Reconstruction, the Black Exodus, and the rise of Jim Crow, the rest of the world did not stand still. Right. The European powers are going to go into Africa. And so what Green starts here, he called it the Scramble for Africa. They met in Berlin, Germany, 1884 to 1885. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the context of framing question 4, when we turn our attention to Africa. By the time of the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, Africa had already been globally connected for many centuries. So part of this framing question 4, we really keep reiterating this. The world has never been completely disconnected. People move, people are connected. So what allows for deeper connections is the improvement in technology. So again, framing question 4, how did Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of these European and American imperialisms that are emerging? We understand that our point of departure, going back to really framing question 2, what is the central theme in human history? Migration. People move. And people have contact with people who have moved before them. So this system of overflowing these artificial lines has been in place since the beginning of human societies that connect with one another, certainly in the contemporary age. And what we see Toby Green talking about in A Fistful of Shells, of course he isn't alone, again, this is just a representative text, is that these networks have been connected for centuries. And the nature of the networks is going to change relative to improvements in technology, improvements in communication, but and then the growth, size, material size kind of thing. But these things are going to connect. So, again, as he says, by the time of the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, Africa had already been globally connected for many centuries. Its gold had fueled the, 1L should be there, the economies of Europe and the Islamic world since around 1000. Of course, many of y'all heard the story of Mansa Musa, and he made the pilgrimage, his Hajj, to Mecca. I guess that was the 13th century, 14th century actually, 1300s. And he gave so much gold away. One of the pillars of Islam is charity, of course. And it is said to have affected the price of gold in the world. By world, of course, meaning the so-called connected world. That it changed the price in the Azteca Empire, but that's another hemisphere, right? Its gold had fueled the economies of Europe and Islamic world since around 1000, and its sophisticated kingdoms, again, Europe and Islamic world, the Islamic world being that world that they can't penetrate, they got to go west to go east, because they can't just come through the Muslims, right? And its sophisticated kingdoms had traded with Europeans along the coast from Senegal down to Angola since the 15th century. Again, that region of West Africa going back again to the book that we mentioned earlier, J.C. Sharman, Empires of the Weak. We're talking about those kind of social barriers to European expansion, the limits of expansion for Europe at that time, until at least 1650. So now we're coming up into the age where Europe has colonized much of the Western Hemisphere, at least established their outposts from which they'll move further. This was a trade of equals, very important, you see, and using a variety of currencies, most importantly shells, the cowrie shells imported from the Maldives and the Nzimbu shells imported from Brazil. So by trade of equals, we're understanding that in the levels of human social organization, you've got an important distinction to make. We're not at level 7 yet. Level 7 would be the one we call the modern world system, the interconnected globe. But we're getting there because now we're at levels 6 and levels 5. You've got regional formations, what some people might call empires, right? But these empires that are being talked about are regional formations connected. Maybe it's a strong military binds them together. Maybe it's a common culture, as in the case with the spread of Islam, or the emerging spread of a kind of European way of knowing, to borrow the phrase from that conceptual category, what we might call European Christianity. Understanding Christianity is an African export, but that by the time it gets into Europe, it adapts itself to European ways of knowing, European movement and memory, European cultural meaning making, so that ultimately you get European Christianity. We don't call it European Christianity. We usually refer to it by another name, at least in its initial iteration. We call it Catholicism. Think of Catholicism as really European Christianity. Ultimately, there will be schisms within Catholicism. Then you get the so-called Protestant Revolution, which is hilarious because most people in Europe couldn't read. So when Martin Luther is tacking up 95 Theses on the door in Wittenberg, most people can't even read it. But you've got to have, in terms of movement and memory, a myth that allows you to congeal this notion of European Christianity into this force. And of course, the Crusades and so forth. I'm sorry, you people watching that who like to sing Onward Christian Soldiers, but that little marker in terms of cultural meaning making speaks to a notion of movement and memory that isn't yours. You soldiers marching against the war with the cross of Jesus going on before. Let's go on to Toby Green, goes on to say in the governance, in his discussion, he goes on to say that, well, actually, the brackets, that's my language. African social structures emerge out of governance systems of kingdoms whose existence, like those of Europe, revolved around warfare, taxation, trade, diplomacy, complex religious beliefs, royal display and extravagance, and the production of art. What does that mean? What Green is writing about is the African governance structures that existed prior to the beginning of enslavement and colonialism. Now let's pause here for the Africana Studies methodology that we've developed. It's a rudimentary basic methodology. See, the details will be in the arguments, the debates, the consensus building, the agreements to disagree that will take place within each of the conceptual categories. But to understand the methodology, think of it as a framework to begin to have the conversations by asking different kinds of questions. What do we mean? And so to make sense of this thing I have in brackets, because people might get confused and think, well, but you said social structure and governance structure are different. They are, but it depends on the context out of which we're talking. Social structure, think of social structure in the framework we're using as asking this question again, who are Africans to other people? Very important to understand. But that only becomes a question in the quote-unquote modern world, meaning the contemporary moment, meaning the more or less 500-year room, to use the phrase again of Ivan Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima says you think of the modern world as quote-unquote existing in a kind of 500-year room. From the time you're old enough to remember going to school, Christopher Columbus, 1492. Why does that become stuck in our minds? Even though there are other things that happen. Askia Muhammad dies. The Moors are technically kind of pushed out of Spain. 1492 becomes an important year in that transition. Yeah, but it's Columbus that marks that, because in terms of European movement and memory, that's what marks the birth of the so-called modern world. That framework, those 5 centuries plus now, since he have come since then, are really the markers through which we view the modern world system. So that's a contemporary global social structure. Africans pulled into the enterprise of Western settler colonialism, European settler colonialism, and ultimately the whole notion of taking over Africa and other places, or trying to anyway. You can't really take over a place as such. These things form the social structure that allows us to use that label, social structure, as a label. So we're asking ourselves, who are Africans to other people? Contrast that with the governance question. The governance question we ask in the modern world system is, who are Africans to each other at any moment that they exist in those larger social structures? Now, what we understand is prior to enslavement, prior to colonialism, any social structure that Africans are participating in on the continent of Africa is a social structure they have created, or in the case of the Maghreb, Northern Africa, or maybe select few other places, have built in tandem with other people. Meaning that the social structures of Africa prior to enslavement and colonialism are African social structures that are also forms of governance that Africans have created themselves to govern how they interact with each other. So governance and social structure are essentially the same thing. If you want to study internal logics of African systems, then you do that in that context. But once those both start showing up, once you start seeing Africans forced into this migration, now you're going to have social structures that Africans didn't create, therefore creating the need to distinguish. Well, yeah, this is why the need to distinguish is important. This is why we talk about this as an Africana studies, a black studies methodology. That's why people who say they're doing black studies but are only talking about it in terms of the subjects they're studying, they're not doing black studies as far as I'm concerned, because they're not approaching it with a methodology that allows them to distinguish between ways of knowing, movement and memory, cultural meaning making, science and technology that people of African descent have either developed or inherited and adjusted to their purposes. They're not distinguishing from that universe of cultural capital and meaning making. They're not distinguishing from all of that and the systems they find themselves in. So what that really does is create a situation where it's not impossible, but it's very difficult then to explore those long genealogies of intellectual work, those long genealogies of cultural work, because they're being obscured by this relation with these European social systems. So this isn't well, there is an ideological dimension of it. Michael Apple, so many others talk about the invisible curriculum. I mean, in some ways, all curriculum is ideological, but it's not dogmatic. It's just an attempt to lower the volume on the relationship to Europe long enough to hear yourself talk to yourself. As Jacob Carruthers writes in the opening pages of his book, Medu-Neter, he says, African champions must break the chain that link African ideas to European ideas and speak to their ancestors without interpreters. That doesn't mean you don't listen to other ideas. It just means that you don't start with those ideas as the framework for your conversation. Think about it like your family. Are you going to talk about your family in relation to how they talk to the light company or how they talk to the federal government? Or are you going to talk about your family in the context of how you talk to each other? Even though you don't ignore those other systems, those other forces that you exist in the world in relation to. So here with Toby Green, what we're saying is African social structures emerged out of African governance systems. Of kingdoms in this case. He's talking about kingdoms here, which means he's around level 5, level 6. You're talking about like the Songhai so-called empire. And that's why I mentioned Askia Muhammad, known as Askia the Great. By the 15th century, you've got Songhai on the scene, right? And Songhai is existing around the same time as you see Ferdinand and Isabella and them being another iteration of folks trying to push back the Arabs and the Africans, the so-called Moors, the Muslims, out of the Iberian Peninsula in another part of the world, what becomes Spain and Portugal, as Cedric Robinson writes in his book, Black Marxism. For all intents and purposes, at this time in world history, Portugal's a metaphor. There's no country called Portugal. You got some city-states and some networks that are beginning to move forward. Read part 1 of his of his Black Marxism, part 1 of a 3-part book. And he really lays out how these things began to emerge. But at the same time in Africa, you got these kingdoms and other formations whose existence, like those of Europe, as we're saying, revolved around warfare, for sure. Some standing armies. Taxation, yes. You got metropoles in West Africa, Timbuktu and Djenné. Very important, 2 of them on the Niger River. When you see the, I guess it's the Amoverites who come in and kidnap the great Ahmed Baba in 1591 and take him off to what is now Morocco. The great Ahmed Baba, one of the great scholars of Timbuktu, an African who's writing in Arabic, but who is conversant with these other cultures in this great cosmopolitan city, this metropolis of Timbuktu. Think about that. In the social structure, Timbuktu becomes a joke. Where you been? Timbuktu? No. Think about that in the governance structure. What was Timbuktu to the people who lived in Timbuktu? This multicultural city. When they take one of the great scholars out, whose books still exist in Timbuktu, some of them. This man who was taken out and taken into exile. Read John Henry Clark's article on Ahmed Baba and the scholars of Timbuktu in the Western Journal of Black Studies, where he quotes Ahmed Baba, who says, when people come to Morocco to see him, and he's like, traveler, whither thou goest to Timbuktu, speak a word from an exile. A man who's been taken into exile 1591. Very important. A century after Columbus. This is still going on in West Africa. One other thing I mentioned, very good work of the great scholar John O. Hunwick. A number of books been written by him on a HBC professor's salary. It's been hard to buy all these books over the years, but one in particular I very much treasure is called The History of Timbuktu and the Songhai Empire. It's a translation of some of this work, and you see Ahmed Baba talking about the guys who trained him. He's a master teacher who was trained by master teachers. Very important. And his students write about him and say, this man lectured and did this work. And sometimes we would be like, where is he getting the strength to do this? He must be drinking Zamzam water. Those of you Muslims know what that is. But at any rate, so this is going on. He's being taken into exile. Warfare, taxation, trade, diplomacy, complex religious beliefs. Very much so. Everybody in Africa then and now is not a Muslim or Christian. and stop saying that anybody who's not a Muslim and a Christian must be an animist. What is an animist? Especially those you Christians who eat bread one Sunday a month and say it turned into Jesus' body in your mouth. Anyway, royal display and extravagance and the production of art. All this is going on in Africa. They're part of governance structures, and when Africans get put on those boats, they are drawn into a world system that they are being drawn as not as blank slates. They are being drawn into this world system as Africans with all kind of ideas, and they're going to use those ideas, particularly when they start exchanging their country marks. Again, to use the language of Michael Gomez, they're going to use that stuff as their foundation for resistance. So in many ways, framing question 4, how did Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? Well, that question actually, even though we're using it to talk about the mid-19th century up to the early 20th century, that process begins when these Africans are forced into conversations with each other as early as when they are captured and are in those holding cells and then on those boats. As Michael Gomez says, they begin to refer to each other, some of them as shipmates. I had to learn your language on that boat, or I had to learn it out here in these fields. And then I had to learn this damn Spanish and this English and this French and this Portuguese. And guess what? We turned that into another kind of thing. A culture of resistance, absolutely, resistance of the social structure, but a different way of knowing that blended the ways of knowing. Vodun is a great place to look at that. Read the work of Robert Ferris Thompson and one of his jegnas, one of his mentors, what some of y'all in anthropology might call informants. Oh, that's an unfortunate term, given what it usually means in the black community. But you think about the work of one of his jegnas, one of his teachers, the great Bunseki Fukiao, Kimwandinde Kia Fukiao, Baba Fukiao, who writes about this question of Mbangi, but who helps Robert Ferris Thompson understand how these things got what Ferris Thompson calls reblended in the Western Hemisphere, in things like Vodun, with the Kikongo people and the Yoruba people and so many others. Many books by Robert Ferris Thompson to look at, none probably more important as introductory text than the book Flash of the Spirit. So Toby Green, after seeing how these Africans got this stuff, he's talking about West Africa. He says, over time, the relationship between Africa and Europe revolved ever more around the trade in slaves. Well, there you go. They were trading all kind of other stuff before. Material goods. There's a shelf of books that have been written about the value, for example, of salt. In fact, there's a book called Salt, A Global History, where, I forget the author, it escapes me at the moment, but the word salt coming from the Latin, the word salt is the basis of the word salary. In other words, what is money but a proxy for value? And value in a world where you don't have refrigeration is salt. So you have salt coming out of Africa, North Africa, out of the Sahara, which used to be green, which means had water. You dry it up, what's left? The salt mines. The Romans are getting this stuff out. It's out of Africa, and it's so valuable that it becomes a proxy for value, for what you trade. And then you have gold, and you have all these other things that are coming out of Africa. The Romans also used to say, out of Africa always something new. They're getting stuff out of Africa. Then they decide they're going to start taking, not the Romans as much, although you get enslavement in the Roman Empire. We will talk about that another time. As I said, well, we'll talk about the question of enslavement in a minute. Because again, for those of you who are not in the class, this is review for a lot of the Howard students. For those of you just kind of watching this because you trapped in your house and pausing every few minutes to write down some book titles and order them from Sankofa, which is what you should be doing, so we can keep this work going with jailbreaking the Black University. You understand that this is not review for you. It's kind of exposure to some ideas that we've already discussed in class. But the point I'm about to make is that they move from gold. They move from, they don't move from gold. They add to salt. They add to gold. They add to the material resources. What Wale Soyinka, in the book that we have in class, students of Africa, also for this framing question, calls the human hatchery. They move to human beings as a resource. And as Toby Green writes, over time, the relationship between Africa and Europe revolved ever more around the trade in slaves, human beings. What effect does that have? Damaging Africa's relative political and economic power as the terms of monetary exchange shifted drastically in Europe's favor. Pause. Some of y'all taking economics classes, y'all got to jailbreak the economics class, you're sitting in your classes, you're taking your test. Apply some of the economic knowledge. Think about this. What happens to the value in what used to be a quote-unquote equal exchange when the exchange now between these polities is more centered around your literal body. For me, I mean, there are a number of people, and I'm no expert on this, but one of the best writers that has informed the way I kind of, whatever little I think I know about this, is the great economic historian out of Nigeria, well, the Nigerian economic historian, Joseph Inokori. Joseph Inokori, who has written a great number of works, late of the University of Rochester, formerly, I guess he's probably emeritus by now. But Joseph Inokori writes about this in terms of the impact of this enslavement on the economies of Africa, and not just the economies of Europe. And he's not alone. He was writing for years, and then, there's a lot of forced migration, I guess, is one of his books, one of probably his most famous book. But you see what's happening. It's going to be drastically in Europe's favor because Europe's economic systems are increasingly attached to this African labor, and Africa's economic systems are being attacked by these systems that are external to Africa. In spite of these growing capital imbalances, however, watch this. Long-standing contacts ensured remarkable connections between the age of revolution in Europe and America and the birth of a revolutionary 19th century in Africa. What Green is then going to talk about is about how these regions influenced each other. But I should pause here to say we should never displace the knowledge. That's wrong. We should never displace the study of how African ways of knowing informed African resistance. So we can't assume. In fact, we shouldn't assume. In fact, it would be, and I'm just going to use this word advisedly, but I'm aware I'm about to say it, stupid to think that African concepts of freedom, African concepts of liberty, African concepts of resistance to oppression didn't exist until one Negro learned enough Latin or learned enough Greek or learned enough English to read Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or somebody stumbled upon some Kant, or God forbid, I'm not even going to get too deep into this, Anton Wilhelm Armah somehow got a dissertation written in Europe and talked about the notion of unfreedom during slavery. Look, I've stood in Elmina, in the mine. I've stood in the dungeon, and you see the grave there, Joseph Capitan. There's been a couple of books written on Capitan, one published by African University Press, and I stood there with Jacob Carruthers and the great thinker who informed so much of our work. And I said, Baba Jetty, he had a Kemetic name too. All you out here calling people hoteps and think that's somehow an insult. You should go back and learn. Maybe Dr. Beatty, when he records his videos on Egyptian hieroglyphs, you'll understand the meaning of the word hotep. Because you might call Jacob Carruthers hotep. You might be calling me one now. But I know one thing, if you haven't written down any book titles and began to study of your own, you're just embarrassing yourself. But standing there with Baba Jetty, who had a Kemetic name, Jetty Shemshu Jehudi, the one who speaks. Jed means to speak in some ways, to make through speech. The one who speaks is a follower of Jehudi. Dr. Jacob Carruthers, PhD, University of Colorado, Boulder, actually went to law school at the University of Texas before he decided to get a PhD. He was a classmate of Hyman Sweat. Those of you going to law school know the famous case, Sweat versus Painter. This is who Jacob Carruthers was, my teacher. And I stood there with Baba Jetty talking about Joseph Capitan in Elmina, in the mine. And I said, Baba, thinking about this brother who has emerged as a figure in what they call African philosophy, how do we balance the idea of these lone individuals who are incorporated into the idea of Western philosophy as African representatives against the vast majority of African traditions? And he said to me, you just got to study the African traditions. And of course, that echoes what he wrote in his book, Medu Neter, when he says, African champions must break the chain that link African ideas to European ideas and speak to their ancestors without interpreters. And what I'm saying here as it relates to Toby Green and what I just said was that the ideas of revolution that emerged in Africa did not emerge exclusively out of their contact with Europe and America age of revolution. Very important to understand. So when we talk about the Black Jacobins, as C.L.R. James talks about, when you read the Black Jacobins, what you see is, yes, he's putting it in the context of the French Revolution and the idea of the individual and very important ideas about the nature of the state and its relationship to the individual. But he's also talking about it in terms of the indigenous African ways of knowing that inform Africana revolutionary practice in what becomes Haiti. These Africans have their own ideas. In fact, let's just move on forward then to Julia Scott's book that we talked about in the previous lecture on this framing question, The Common Wind. Afro-American Currents in the Age of the Haitian Revolution, Julius Scott. Marcus Rediker wrote the foreword to this edition. Remember I told y'all this was Scott's dissertation, I think 1986, and it finally came out as a book. It's good to see this came out as a book while his brother was alive, because a lot of the scholarship, most of the scholarship in the world is not written down. It's mouth to ear, and it's in classrooms and study, which is why you can't replace, as I said, the classroom. You can't replace the formation. Some of the stuff finds its way into books. More of the stuff is in dissertations. I got a 600-page dissertation on some of this stuff, never been published yet. But we'll work on that now with this little break. Probably can finally get some of these books out. But the point is, and then come out Black Classic Press, then you can buy it from Sankofa from a black publisher. Some of you Negroes who publish with university presses might want to think about doing the same. But Scott's dissertation becomes a book, came out last year, and in it, it's a gripping and colorful account of the intercontinental networks that tied together the free and enslaved masses of the New World. Having delved deep into the gray obscurity of official 18th century records in Spanish, English, and French, in other words, he's going into these archives, right? The archive again, Julius S. Scott has written a powerful history from below. This phrase is difficult, tied back to those 3 American revolutions that Robinson is talking about. History from below, as distinguished from the history of the elites. Typically, for example, American history, you talk about George III and the British versus the Americans. But who do you mean by the Americans? You mean the white elites. So you're looking at the debates, you're looking at the Federalist Papers, you're looking at Thomas Paine, Common Sense, you're looking at the back and forth between, you're reading Somerset's case and making that a proxy for the idea of abolition in England. And so it's elite discourse. But history from below would mean you're looking at the poor whites and seeing how they're going to think about this. As Robinson says, maybe they were fighting against the white elites in the colonial period. You want to go read a little bit about this in terms of a fictional imagining that's drawn from a lifetime of study and thinking about these things? Read Toni Morrison's novel, A Mercy, where you see the poor whites trying to figure this thing out alongside the blacks and others, sometimes in conflict, sometimes together. And history from below, think about the history of the Africans. That's what Scott is doing. It's not going to be necessarily in the archive, the written archive, in any language, although he's going to start there. Because some of that archive is going to contain what these Europeans wrote down based on what they heard from these Africans. Other things, you're just going to have to gloss it, as they call. I guess cultural studies might use it to say that the interstitial interpretation. You know, jazz musicians would just say like, Monk, the space between the notes. We got the notes, but what's the space between the notes? I got to make that up in my mind. That's where you need to have a cultural ear to listen for those spaces. So Scott is writing through all that, what some people will call history from below. Scott follows the spread of rumors of emancipation and the people behind them, bringing to life the protagonists in the slave revolution. You got to bring that out. How are you going to find those people if you don't have material traces, books, things like that? You got to listen for them in the space between the documents. By tracking the colliding worlds of buccaneers, military deserters, and maroon communards from Venezuela to Virginia, Scott records the transmission of contagious mutinies. Love that phrase. Contagious mutinies. Different kind of contagion. The virus of we will be free. And it ain't coming from Hegel. It ain't coming from John Locke. It's not coming from Rousseau. It's coming from the Africans themselves. It may be informed by some of those things once they become aware of those things. And by they, I mean the black elites. Read Prince Sanders, P.V. Vasty in the French Revolution, who are becoming aware of some of these ideas. Trace that through, you got some great people out there doing some incredible work, including people who convened a forum in North Carolina around the work of Julius Scott and invited him down there a few months ago. Very important. What's my man's name? I'm thinking about all these people. David Gigas, who's writing about the French Revolution. Jane Landers, writing about maroonage. So many people. I'm just thinking about some of these characters, and a couple of them come to mind, but they'll come to me in a minute or not. But y'all can do the research for yourself. Y'all are all locked up now, so you can just sit on your Google machine and figure it out. But this contagious mutiny, this thing is important. Peter Hinks writes a book, To Awake My Afflicted Brethren. You got David Walker writing out of the Northeast states, Massachusetts, sending stuff out, sewing David Walker's appeal into the clothes of black sailors who were coming into the ports along the eastern seaboard, and then getting the stuff out, giving it to people. You're seeing the spread, but read David Walker's appeal for yourself. You understand these contagious mutinies and why they are considered so dangerous, this literature. And insurrections in unparalleled detail, that's what he's writing, providing readers with an intellectual history of the enslaved. Very important to understand. People have their own ideas about liberation. So that's governance and some of the ways of knowing that are forming in this notion of how Africans are beginning to perceive and conceive of unity in thought and action beyond what is now then colonial boundaries, which harden into state boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism. That's the social structure they're operating in. Those of you in Louisiana, y'all know about the Whitney Plantation. The book. There's a book written by the brother who is one of the quote-unquote curators of the Whitney Plantation. Buka Faye. It'll come to me anyway. It's a phrase taken out of one of the West African languages that he uses at the title of the book. It talks about how they try to recover ways of knowing of the Africans who found themselves enslaved on this plantation. These are actual statues of Africans down there in Louisiana. I haven't been yet. I've been really wanting to go. Those of you, when they lift this thing, I'll get down there one day. But governance, ways of knowing, these are the next two categories, category 2, category 3, the process of becoming black and country people. I'm using that because on plantations is where they exchange their different ideas. In fact, let's just go on to that and say that, these national language identities blend and reblend in the various social structures. This is the exchange of country marks. This borrows again from the great brother at New York University, the great Michael Antonio Gomez, who wrote this book, Exchanging Our Country Marks, where he talks about how these different groups, the Akan, the Bambara, when they find themselves enslaved, they now must not only combine with each other, because many of these people didn't know each other, right? I mean, enslavement is being taken, people are taken from different places, whether it be Inakori, who I mentioned before, Joseph Miller from the University of Virginia, who's been writing about this in terms of West Central Africa for decades. So many historians of slavery. Look at the slavery database that, the three Davids, Eltis, Richardson, and Blight, who, are credited with the published book or the slavery database, which is online. Look at where these boats are coming from. They don't even know each other. They have to form these identities. So they exchange what we might call our country marks. Howard students, you may remember the former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Segun Badageshin, great African philosopher, Yoruba philosophy in particular. And, this brother is of an age where when he went through his rites of passage, he got his marks, 3 on this cheek, 3 on this cheek. Going horizontally, right? And, what Gomez is saying is, at some point, his ancestors come into contact with other ancestors who got different marks. So guess what? We can no longer see each other as being different from each other completely, even as we may maintain seeing each other as distinct from each other. Because Gomez writes about the fact you have Bambara in places like New Orleans or Louisiana, then we don't intermarry. What does that mean, Negro? We're all in the same plantation. So you got to start exchanging these marks. In other words, you got to start making a culture out of all of your culture, that gumbo culture, so to speak. So Gomez is writing about that. That is really how the ways of knowing comes out, and that's how you become black. The label you were given, and country people, meaning what? You're from my country. What is my country now? My country is less my geographic origin. My country is now my place, and my place is with you, our place now. This is the origins of the concept, young people, of the cookout. How did you make the cookout? You made the cookout by being invited to the cookout. Who gets invited to the cookout? People who become part of our country. Now, you can invite somebody to cookout, but if we didn't clear them, they can't come to the cookout. Y'all on social media right now talking about who can come to the cookout. This is the origins. You exchange your country marks, and it becomes the way of knowing that informs the governance structure of marronage or maroonage that allows for resistance of the social structure we find ourselves in, that oppressive social structure. And by the time we get to framing question 4, mid-19th century, you have reached a moment when your resistance, even though it's adapted to wherever you find yourself, you're now looking up with improved technology, communication networks, transportation networks, and you now become aware of how other Africans are resisting. And then you embrace even a larger concept of country, maybe as large as blackness as an international phenomenon, Africa as an idea beyond any one place. And in that respect, what you find, whether it's Michael Gomez in Exchanging Our Country Mark, whether it's Walter Rucker writing about Gold Coast diasporas, where you see people from what is now Ghana going everywhere in enslavement and continue to maintain some sense of identity, or the great Kwasi Kanadu. This is a very important brother out of New York. Kwasi Kanadu, young brother, PhD, Howard University, African Studies. Kwasi talks about the Akan diaspora in the Americas. He's written extensively on how these connections maintain themselves and then bleed into larger networks. And of course, the godfather of much of this, the great Sterling Stuckey, in his book, Slave Culture, There's a chapter in there devoted to a person who is one of his was one of his cultural heroes. He had written about him long before that. And this brother, whose ancestors came out of North Carolina, who was raised in Somerset, New Jersey, then Princeton, New Jersey, who went to Rutgers, became an All-American football player, then graduated from Rutgers Columbia Law School, then became an international singing star, then joined with his wife, who was a trained scientist in chemistry, to take over the motion picture industry. This brother had a phrase that he would say all the time. This man I'm talking to, this hero of Southern Stucky, the great Paul Robeson, said, I want to be African. Meaning what? I've got a view of the world, of human solidarity that transcends citizenship in any one place. I'm not going to tie it to the local politics exclusively. I'm going to connect beyond national boundaries. So we study Paul Robeson students in the class. As you know, we've talked about this as part of the answer to framing question 4, how do Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? They begin to see the connections that are cultural, not the same, but similar and connected. And when Robeson says that, his wife says that. Read her book, African Journey. She and their child, their son, Paul Jr. Paul, they go to Africa. She's organizing women in Africa. Very important to look at that. When you see them embrace this identity that transcends the United States, that, as I said, is when the United States government turns on them and then appeals to part of the black elite to do the same thing. The Robesons, the Du Boises, the Pattersons, the Huntons, as I talked about, all these people beginning to see each other beyond national boundaries, not just Africans, but global solidarity movements. But for Robeson, it's grounded, it's rooted, actually for all the couples I mentioned, it's rooted in African identity. Especially for the Robesons, the Du Boises, in some ways the Huntons as well. Look at a book Penny Von Eschen wrote along with Kevin Gaines called Race Against Empire, the Council on African Affairs. We'll get to that framing question 5. We won't cover everything. We're just doing a little bit of something here because we out now. Those of you who are watching this would know that we were in real time. I'll be having this conversation with 240 students in this intro class, Africans from all over the world and others, and they would have stopped me 15 times by now. But we're setting up a Zoom session for any questions you all have. And I may do 1 or 2 of those from my house where I can just pull the books and show them to you and we can walk through them. So these labels, Negro, Black, Padraos, Mestizos, things I talked about, these are labels that Africans were given that they then stand up and weaponize as part of their struggle. The interests begin to be voiced based on proximity to power and socialization. So in any specific place, they're learning how to write petitions. They're learning how to resist. Physical resistance could be large scale, like the Haitian Revolution, or Point Coupé, or Stono in South Carolina. Could be small, breaking tools, day-to-day resistance, all that stuff that people are writing about and talking about now. Intellectual resistance, as I said, writing petitions, trying to figure out the politics on the ground. Very quickly, again, by way of review, social structure versus governance structure. In the United States, for the African experience, you've got people coming across trying to create the United States. 1789 is people living all in here. But these Europeans going to come and try to push forward. The blue's supposed to be free states. The red's supposed to be enslaved portions. But you all know what that means. Very little, because this Northwest Ordinance of 1787, for example, contains a fugitive slave clause. If they catch you up in here, you're supposed to be down here, they can return you. Well, what if they catch you up in here and you're not supposed to be, or you are free? Well, it don't matter. We might snatch you anyway. Look at that. New York is red. Slave state. 1789. Right. Let's be very clear about New Amsterdam, now New York. Every year we take students to the New York African Burial Ground, which was an active burial ground at this period, and had been now for over centuries. So therefore, it's very important to understand. Movement and memory. Question mark. Why? Again, why do you have to separate social structure from governance structure if you're doing Africana studies methodologically as a discipline rather than just interest in black stuff? No, it's the how, not the what. How do you study Africana experiences? Framing question 1, you've got to be clear about distinguishing social structure and governance structure, because if not, you'll commingle the movement and memories. And if you commingle the movement and memories, the ways of knowing, the cultural meaning makings, even the use of science and technology, you'll never get at the deeper questions you can get different answers to if you speak to your ancestors without interpreters. These are interpreters. Some of y'all know them as your parents. They're called the founding fathers. It's not, I don't have a father in that picture, but I think some of you might. For those of you who don't, and for those of you who do, let's be clear. Of the people in this picture who I would say are my favorites, even though I hope if I were alive on his plantation, I've been trying to kill him or at least escape during that time, was James Madison. He's a very interesting character. Madison, they call the father of the Constitution. My nephew may be watching this, although he's almost a grown man now. He'd be 18 years old. When he was 11, we went to Montpelier. We sat in James Madison's library. I said, son, you know, we think about this. This is where this man made up this Constitution, or at least read these books to think about it. Very important to think of him as an intellectual, but also as a human being. Read, is it Paul Jennings? Paul Jennings, who was enslaved by Madison, who was there the day Madison died. Paul Jennings actually left a memoir because Dolly Madison was broke. And, you know, one of the things they did to make some more money on his plantation is James Madison, the family sold the notes that he wrote, because he wasn't supposed to be writing notes, but he wrote the notes for the federal Constitution, and they sold that, and that's what restored the wealth that allowed Dolly Madison to live. But Paul Jennings, who was enslaved by the Madisons, actually gave her money over the years. In fact, read his memoir for yourself. You'll be laughing out loud when you see how the black people talked about James Madison and his wife when they were running during the War of 1812, and they was over in Georgetown. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. James Madison, these guys are considered the founding fathers, but how do we remember them? First of all, who is we? During the national period, social structure, 1787, United States Constitution, they create America, United States of America. Settler expansionism creates an American self and an other. All means y'all. American white self, meaning what? Citizenship, again, tied to this racial identity. So it isn't just the extension of rights, it's the extension of a cultural concept of self and other. Manifest destiny. God told us we could have it. Go watch Schoolhouse Rock. That's all I tell you. Elbow Room, that one. And the irony, of course, of many of the Schoolhouse Rock things that used to come on ABC, those little cartoons, is the music underneath them is in many ways a record of American culture, if you can call it American culture, and much of that culture is African. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Yeah. Verb, that's what's happening. It's black music. But at any rate, the Indians and the frontier. So the idea is the Indians are not Americans. And what is the frontier? The frontier is the other against which whiteness defines itself perpetually. It could be a domestic frontier, a terrestrial frontier. In this case, it's the United States that don't exist yet. We're going to go from sea to signing sea. Who is we? Settlers, because there are people living there. And once you've got, in fact, the last line in the Schoolhouse Rock elbow room, what is it? And sure, if there should ever come a time when we're crowded up together, I'm sure we'll find some elbow room up on the moon. Oh, elbow room. Now they go into space. And what do they call space in Star Trek? The final frontier. In other words, the aliens. It's always an other that you're imposing yourself on in a quest. In a quest kind of define yourself. So the frontier in this case is a terrestrial frontier. It's the United States they're going to build. And the other is not only the Indians who you don't know, you got to guard those others in your midst. This is why Alan Taylor names his book The Internal Enemy. Who is the internal enemy? Who does Nikhil Pal Singh, as I said in his book Black as a Country, define as the anti-citizen? The Negro. And it isn't just a matter of rights, it's a matter of concept. So no matter how hard you fight, Black Lives Matter, yeah, who are you talking to? Do you know your life matters? Yes. Then why are you saying it? Why? Because they don't understand. I'm a man. Do you know you're a man? Yes. Then who are you talking to? Them. Why? Because I'm defining what I have to do in this moment by having to define myself to them. Think about arguing for your humanity every day. That's one reason I chose to work in black institutions, including a black college. I'm not going to argue about my humanity every day. I got other questions I want to ask my ancestors. And I'm going to talk to them without interpreters. Back to these interpreters. Labor relations, slave economy fuels the expansion. That's the social structure. Governance relations, marronage requires the creation of legal identity for Africans. Meaning what? Black people are escaping. Black people are turning away from the project. The only way you can sustain the project is to allow some of them into the project. This would be Antonio Gramsci. I ain't no Marxist, and I read enough Gramsci, and Gramsci intrigues me when he talks about resistance and incorporation. When you got a hegemonic system, a system that's dominating, part of maintaining it means you got to concede enough to those who you're oppressing so that they don't just completely walk away from you. It's very important to understand. That's what they're trying to work out now in terms of this coronavirus thing. Do we give them all $1,000 a piece? Do we all? Because if we don't give them something, they're going to come to my house. Exactly. You've got to figure out a way to sustain the thing. Charles Mills writes about the racial contract in his book, The Racial Contract. Brother from the Caribbean, philosopher, very important work. Many books since then, but this book talks about how this notion of whiteness is commingled into this legal formation, right? And it's important to understand. Oh man, this is a problem. Yeah. Where did this slide come from? Okay, yeah. I'm kidding. Some of y'all went to see Hamilton. It's very nice. I love the music. I like the mixtape better. That's the second thing that came out. The stuff that didn't make it into the musical, the things that they remixed. I love the Roots. Anytime you put the Roots, Nas on the track, I'm gonna listen to that. Right. There's one in particular on this Hamilton mixtape, Cabinet Battle Number 3, where you hear, "Come with me, Hail Mary." You got the Tupac thing underneath it, because most of this stuff in Hamilton basically, remixed stuff from Biggie and all them. But the Tupac joint that didn't make it into the play, it says, the issue on the table is the end of slavery. And then you hear, Hamilton is arguing with Washington and them, he's arguing with Madison and them, talking about when we going to end this slave trade. Let's be clear. The music is great. There's a lot of genius in the lyrics, but here's the problem with black or brown-faced minstrelsy. As my friend Adolph, I said Adolph, but I meant Ishmael Reed. I got a chance to interview Ishmael Reed, actually, on his book on Muhammad Ali. He came to Howard Bookstore. We had a long conversation. One of the things I always respected about this brother, you may agree or disagree with him, that ain't as much as important as if you have to know the fact he's pushing you to think. Some of you all are fans of his fiction. Y'all may know his work, Mumbo Jumbo, for example. What you might be surprised to learn, some people who are not black nationalists, is that Mumbo Jumbo is a favorite in many black nationalist communities. You may think the nationalists might not like that. Jacob Carruthers, for example, used to talk to Bob Bajeti. He'd be like, I have to say this about Ishmael Reed. He got it right. This critique of black nationalism, in fact, this whole notion of using Hotep as a pejorative. Some of you may not know that the use of Hotep as a pejorative began in black communities, as black people, particularly sisters, were like, man, some of these cats are predators out here. Hello, Queen, Hotep Queen. And so it's saying, you're using this culture out of context, so we're going to put this label on you. But of course, it exceeded the internal conversation and now has become a pejorative by people who have no interest in building any notion of black solidarity. And so for those of you who are fit in that category, I would just say, well, I shouldn't say anything because you're not watching this anyway. So the whole point is that in this context, what we have is black and brown-faced minstrelsy. In other words, you can't make these interfounding ballads by putting talented black and brown people in the costumes and using the words. You still got to read the Federalist Papers. You still got to read the Conversations. You still have to understand that you can make it look culturally. You can put it to your soundtrack, but the ideological formation of that social structure has not been displaced. Now you're replicating it. Clyde Taylor would probably have a very good time with this. He might call this one of his ironies, Aesopian irony. It wouldn't even be a Chabian irony. If you want to know more about that, the irony of this, I would say read Clyde Taylor's book, The Mask of Art. But the slave revolution continues in in Cedric Robinson's Black Movements in America. Howard students, again, we're building our way toward the mid-19th century. In this second lecture, I think we have one more after this, and we'll be finished with framing question 4. Continue from before the national period throughout the period until the ending of the U.S. Civil War. You've got Africans fighting everybody. That Civil War end is going to be where we go for the framing question 4. And we talked about this already. 3 American revolutions, documenting indifference and interest, and the slave revolutions continue. Now, very quickly, and we'll go through these next set of slides. Maybe do about 10, 15 more minutes and we'll be done for today, and we'll continue. The post-1787 compromises. So after you've got a federal constitution in place for the United States, you've got the 3/5 Compromise, the Northwest Ordinance, meaning what? You're going to count these Africans in the South. You couldn't count these Africans who were enslaved, but you're only going to count 60% of the population. Why? Because if you count 100% of the population in the South, the Southern states going to overwhelm the federal framework. Now, if you go read James Madison's notes or the official account of the Constitutional Conventions, either one, you'll see the debates from Rhode Island and other places, and these little states are saying, if you're going to count the blacks in the South, I want to count my chickens. I want to count my horses. I mean, we need to count them all. We talking about counting living creatures because they property even. And so then they go back to the Federalist Papers and they're making the same arguments they made there. Read Federalist 54, Federalist 55. They're debating about the nature of the Africans. Are they people? Yes. Are they property? Yes. Are they people? Are they property? In the words of Future, yes, at the same damn time. Meaning what? How you then gonna count them because they're not citizens? They've been excluded from citizenship. We'll count 60% of them. Why? That'll give you some value, and in this case, it gives them enough value for the South to be really the center of American political power at the beginning through the Civil War, and in some ways to the day. Because they may have lost the Civil War on the battlefield, but in terms of a culture, we talk about national culture. You got a guy from New York running around to Hillbilly Klan rally talking about our country, our country. When he says our country, he's not talking about me. He's talking to that notion of this artificial identity, this weaponized whiteness that holds together the national concept. It begins by excluding. The Rickless Compromise, Northwest Ordinance has a fugitive slave law, and then the Haitian Revolution jumps off, as we saw, and it scares the hell out of any place with any settler colony with enslaved Africans, including the United States. 1820, the Great Compromise creates a 3630 parallel, and then they had a question of black citizenship. They put a line across as they're coming across the continent. Anything above this comes in free. Anything below this can come in enslaved. Missouri's an outlier. It's above the 3630 parallel, latitude and longitude. But we'll debate the nature of enslavement. Remember now, New York's going to eventually abolish enslavement. So now you get some sense of moral superiority in the North that ain't never really real, except they get to say we don't have legal enslavement. It's the basis of every civil rights documentary ever made. But anyway. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. They're going to reinforce this thing. Free up here, not free down there. What about escape here? The abolitionists may hide you. The black abolitionists may hide you. Read Peter Ripley's 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers when you want to see the governance structure of black people. Martin Delaney, Mary Ann Shadd Carey and her family, Abraham Shadd and them in Canada. Brilliant work. They're going to hide you. But what about the government? We may return them Negroes. Whole nother thing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So 1857, my man, Roger Taney squashes the whole thing. Dred and Harriet Scott, their 2 kids. They're in the upper Mississippi. That's where Minnesota is now. Any of y'all Minnesota know, y'all have been to Fort Snelling. I made them take me to Fort Snelling. I want to see the place where they had Dred and Harriet Scott enslaved. And that's also where Lincoln signed a death warrant on Little Crow and the Native Americans. There's a book called 38 Nooses that talks about how they put those Native Americans to death. This is the death warrant, the largest death warrant signed to that date in American history because they consider them insurrectionists. These are enemies of the United States of America because they're Native Americans fighting to be free, the Lakotas. At any rate, they get brought back to Missouri. They in St. Louis. They sue for their freedom, saying, "Well, we were in a free place." They win at the lower court, but then it's overturned. They get to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, "Look, Roger Taney, Chief Justice, says there are no rights in this country that black people have that we are bound to respect." Who is we? He said you got a national citizenship and you're also a citizen of the state. You're a citizen of the United States of America and of the state that you're in. You black people, you might think you are free in a place, but are you free in the United States? It's a legal fiction. You understand? Let's bring this forward right now as we're sitting in sequester with the largely Democratic governors, Cuomo in New York, Gavin Newsom in California, in Illinois, Pritzker, these cats, right, who are declaring everybody shelter in place. Why? They're doing that because as they're the chief executives of their states. This is a federated state. While Donald Trump is having press conferences that are really campaign rallies every day on TV looking like this and saying crazy stuff as the doctors squinch up their faces, the governors are now emerging and saying, no, we got to take charge of this thing. Roger Taney is saying, yeah, the states are individual. They're connected as the United States, but for you Negroes, I know what the law says in New York, but you're a Negro, which means you're not a citizen of the United States. So at any moment, they can rescind your citizenship and it'll be backed by the United States. The Dred Scott decision is not as an outlier as some people might say. You might read, what's my man's name? Mark Ridley, I think Ridley's last name. Dred Scott and the question of constitutional evil. You can read, it's a lot. Look at the legal scholarship on this. This is where my students from Howard Law School, we would be reading the Dred Scott case sometime in the next month or so, at parts of it, and then talking about this. It's not an outlier. It's based in this notion of federalism. Now there's going to be some prestidigitation. He's going to do some legal meandering. Most of the law in this country is judge-made law. But his legal reasoning is not so fallacious that it can just be thrown out. Mark Graeber. Mark Graeber is making the notion that his legal decision is based in an underlying cultural concept, constitutional evil. This document was not written by gods. No matter what James Madison or Lin-Manuel Miranda might tell you, it's written by human beings who are trying to expand a settler project and keep it bound together. And so when you get to the question of national blackness, this is a problem to this day. 1860, it's going to lead to the Civil War in some ways, that decade before, because this is where some people argue the United States is finally created. Lincoln says, I'll keep them all slaves. I'll free some of them. I'll do whatever it is to bind the Union. What keeps the Union together? Military force, to the tune of 200,000, well, 189,000 and 10,000 in the U.S. Navy, part of that, black men, and all the black women who fought, who were never allowed to have formal service in the military, including our mentor, Harriet Ross Tubman. Some of y'all know about the Combahee River battle and some of that stuff. I mean, Harriet Tubman probably directs these troops in battle. First woman to do that of any background. But the point is that these Africans do that. Now, what do they get as a result? We're still trying to work that out. So, in fact, Derek Bell would call that the principle of the involuntary sacrifice. They did not do that because they love America so much. Forget all the movies. Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, Harriet, whatever. Forget all those movies, because those are movement and memory attempts to keep the national project together by creating icons and shrines and totems. Hold out the social structure long enough to have a conversation with your ancestors. Go read the documents. Go listen to the conversations and see what they wanted. Derek Bell would say there's an involuntary sacrifice. I did not do this for myself. I did this for the future. I did this for my descendants. And if you get helped, I'm great. I love that. I'm not trying to stop you, but you're not going to keep me a slave. That gets rewritten into, I did that for America, for the great possibilities of the future. That's the problem of having ways of knowing conversation where you haven't tuned down those other people long enough to talk to your ancestors. Very important. So let's go through these next maps right quick. By 1800, going back in time again, they're still coming across. This is still Louisiana. Spain has it, but Spain and France always fighting. See, usually down around here, the Gulf of Mexico. New Orleans been in both those hands going, but then something happens in 1804. Toussaint Louverture happens, and the Africans, well, actually, Boyce came on. You talking about Boukman Dutty and them? Go read about the Haitian Revolution again. All those people writing about the Haitian Revolution. The name that escaped me earlier that comes to mind now is the scholar Laurent Dubois. Laurent Dubois has written a number of one. I love the first book that he published in a long line of publications. The title alone, Avengers of the New World. Start with Dessalines. I've avenged America. Meaning what? We are coming out of our ways of knowing. So when you see Boukman Dutty, in fact, Jacob Carruthers, long before Laurent Dubois, long before David Gegas, long before the Haitian Studies crowd, Jacob Carruthers published a book called The Irritated Genie. You could buy it at Sankofa, www.sankofa.com. And in that book, Jacob Carruthers translates again and quotes from the priests at the Boukman Dutty at the Boyce came on ritual, where he says they slaughtered this animal, and then at the height of the ritual, he says, cast down the image of the white man's God who has brought down your tears for so long, and listen to liberty that lives in all our hearts. That's not from reading philosophy of history, Georg Hegel. That is from his traditions, from the Vodun tradition. And some of you Haitians, those of you know, I would pause here if this were a live class in my class, and there'd be some Haitian students in this class, either born and raised in Haiti or born and raised in Brooklyn, whose parents came from Haiti. And I would be like, I know why you Haitians are so proud. Why? Because what's the saying in Haiti? Haiti is 99% Catholic and 100% Vodun. So what happens? When Toussaint and his armies beat back the French, they invite Toussaint over to France for a conversation on negotiating terms, and he dies in a prison. Dessalines takes over and says, oh, the French, give me my sword. Okay, we're going to cut the white out of the middle of the Haitian flag because it looked too much like the French flag. And then this sister right here, Catherine, last name escapes me. They call her the Betsy Ross of Haiti. let's put an end to that right now, or at least a pause in it. Some of you may want to still do that, but know when you're doing it, that's a social structure conversation. Who are Africans to other people? She's her own person, and in Haiti, she's seen as the mother of the Haitian flag, because once this white is carved out, she sews it together, and that's why the Haitians got that red and blue flag with that little white square in the middle that says, "In unity there is strength." This is very important to understand, because governance, ways of knowing, how does it impact the social structure? Haiti is ascendant, and Haiti becomes the symbol, the Avengers, not of Haiti, the Avengers of the New World, the Avengers of the Hemisphere. And as news of the Haitian Revolution spreads, first to places like New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, because some of these people going to flee and take Africans with them. And these Africans get off the boat in New Orleans and say, "Where y'all coming from?" "We come from Haiti, and we won." Damn, now it's spreading all over. They won. There's a place where we won. And then you see in Charleston, in South Carolina, Denmark Vesey. They put those cats on trial. Read the transcript of the trial of Denmark Vesey. And you can go and get the newer editions. A lot of scholars have done some fine work. Go back in the stats. John Oliver Killings, some of y'all know that name, great writer, edited something called the Trial Record of Denmark Vesey. Well, wrote a foreword to it. You see them in there, and they're on trial now. Why? Because these Negroes tried to take over the whole city. They're gonna have an insurrection. And they asked them, what was y'all gonna do? When a cat says, "We were told that if we could just get to the harbor, there would be a boat there to take us to St. Dominique." Oh, what? Yes, we going to Haiti. Why? We won in Haiti. How do Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries? We don't give a damn about these flags. If you want to know how much black people care about flags, watch the Olympics. Black people going to cheer for black people when they run under the American flag. But if it's a relay or a heat where it's somebody black running and they the only black person running, and they got a Haitian flag on, or a Jamaican flag on, or a Nigerian flag on, the American Negro is going to cheer for that person. They're not looking at the flag. They're looking at the person. It transcends national boundaries. It's a difficult thing for people to stomach who live in settler colonies who want people to turn first inward. It's never been the case, because African people have always been perceived in the social structure as the internal enemy, quoting Alan Taylor. But let's continue. Oh yeah, Dessalines rips it out. "I've avenged America. You sew this together." So what happens? Well, Napoleon wants to win stuff in Europe, so what does he do? Well, let's quote Elbow Room, Schoolhouse Rock, the way you learned it in the social structure. "In 1803, the Louisiana territory was sold to us without a fuss and gave us lots of elbow room." Who is us? Napoleon had to sell what he didn't really possess to America to get him a license. And guess what? Some of y'all St. Louis Negroes, land of Nelly, country grammar was 20 years old this year. They got an arch right there. Why? Because Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea and York go all the way out here. But except Lewis and Clark don't know nothing about this. Sacagawea knows something about it. York don't know nothing, but he keeps learning the languages of the people. York was the African who was enslaved by them, who was learning the languages, who they would send out before. And there's a couple of statues of York in the country. In fact, one good book of poetry by my very good friend Frank X. Walker, who is at the University of Kentucky. He wrote a whole poetic ode, deeply researched, to York, Y-O-R-K. Get that man's book. You can read about the African that was with Lewis and Clark. But the only reason they're going this way is because the Haitians beat the French, and Napoleon had to dump what becomes known as the Louisiana Purchase, which you read in your history books, in the social structure. And don't forget that the reason York's got to learn languages is because they got millions of people living out here. This is settler colonialism we're talking about, as Roxana Dunbar Ortiz would talk about. Then, of course, Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831. This is about a decade, 9 years after Denmark Vesey, South Carolina, which is about 20 years after Gabriel Prosser, 1800. I'm just naming the men, but really those men are labels for women and men and children who are resisting in these areas. Virginia, South Carolina. My man is saying, I'm going to deal out my citizenship one cudgel at a time. Right? It's very nice. And, of course, Will the executioner read the so-called Confession of Nat Turner? You know, even the baby's got to go. Why? We can't. I'm sorry, it's maybe too much for some of y'all. Read the Confession of Nat Turner, and if you can manage it, since everybody's trapped inside, look up Birth of a Nation, not 1915, not The Birth of a Nation by Griffin, But look at The Birth of a Nation that was made as a riff on the Nat Turner Rebellion by Nate Parker, good brother, who started a film enterprise, a filmmaking school at Wiley College. Because remember, he also was in The Great Debaters. Very important to understand. We're setting aside any notion and conversation about other issues and not saying that we should be uncritical, but if we didn't watch the art, didn't listen to the music, didn't deal with the scholarship of anybody who did anything that people don't like or disagree, you'd be, well, I guess just sitting there looking at yourself in the mirror wondering why you should write anything down, because ain't nobody in a position not to do that. But go read Birth of a Nation or go watch the film. There's that 30 degree parallel. Anything above is supposed to come in free. Anything below is supposed to come in enslaved. There's Missouri, the site of the crime of Dred Scott, 1837. We're coming across. But guess what? These people here, the Mexicans, this is all Mexico. Disputed between Mexico and Texas. No, that's because a bunch of white colonizers came out here, including Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, y'all know the names, Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin. These are the names they celebrate, movement and memory in Texas to this day. They say we're going to make a republic, their own country, the Lone Star country, not a Lone Star state. Well, the Mexicans end up abolishing enslavement. Think about that next time you celebrate Cinco de Mayo. We'll talk about it another day, because it also ties the abolishment of enslavement. Oh, what happened? They took it. The Americans come in and help them. Remember the Alamo, but don't remember from the social structure. Remember from the governance structure. Wilmot Proviso, that's a little bit beyond this. We talked about these in some of the other maps. We talked about this actually in the last day of class. So I'm catching up now in frame question 4. So we're going to do one more after this to where we need to be to answer the rest of the question. Dred and Harriet Scott, their children, buried about 10 minutes from where Mike Brown's body lay in the sun after he was murdered. We talked about this in class as well. There's from the social structure, Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, but didn't break off Josiah Henson, whom it was based, didn't break him off with a check. We talked about that a little bit as well. That's why Martin Delany ended up writing his book. There's Delany, Major Delany. There's his friend Robert Campbell from Jamaica. They went to Nigeria, told the Alake of Abeokuta that they could corner the cotton market with Africans, and they said, okay, we could do that. Then the Civil War jumped off. There's Martin Delany, Brother Kabir, who made transition late last year, 2019. We are actually at the Wilberforce Museum of African American History and Culture, the first national museum before, well, a contemporary of the Anacostia Museum in Smithsonian, but before the National Museum here on the Mall. The great Lawrence Franklin Crowe, L. Franklin Crowe, Larry Crowe, who started this years ago, one of the great scholars in our tradition. If you don't know the name Larry Crowe, it's very important to know him. C-R-O-W-E. This is us in the Wilberforce Cemetery at the grave of Martin Delany, Catherine Delany. Their children are buried all around in here. Hallie Quinn Brown, the great librarian, shout out to all the black women librarians, is buried over there. Charles Young's children are in that graveyard. William Sanders Scarborough. These are the Africans who congealed around Wilberforce University and Central State University. Meaning making. African cultural meaning making versus European meaning making. Blake versus Uncle Tom's Cabin. Read Blake. Blake is the book. If you're going to read one between Blake and Uncle Tom's Cabin, www.sankofa.com. Get you a copy of Blake. In fact, we could probably do a Blake study group. We got time to do that now. At any rate, because Blake is a historical novel. He writes a fictional novel about this dude who actually goes out and frees himself, comes back, gets his wife, gets his parents, frees them, goes around the hemisphere into the Caribbean, gets on a boat, works backward going to Africa, starting playing an international slave rebellion. Much better than Uncle Tom's Cabin, Topsy and all him. 1858, we're getting up close. Look at him coming across. Look at him coming across. This is called the Indian Territory. What does that mean? The idea was all the Native Americans, we're going to put them there. That lays the foundation for what ends up being black people coming into this territory, the Seminoles. Remember I told you all, the Guerimas are working on this Maroon project. They interviewed a lot of Africans who came to this territory with the concept of Maroonage, including Africans marched across the Trail of Tears, the Seminoles, into this place. They got black so-called black Seminoles, right? Whole really complicated relationship. Only other thing I say is that this, of course, is the place that we will end up seeing the foundations for black Maroonage, self-determination that ends up in what they call Black Wall Street. The names of 3 streets, GAP, become the foundation for black self-determination as expressed in cultural meaning making in something called the Gap Band. They're from Tulsa, Oklahoma. You dropped a bomb on me. Y'all know that song. That's because of Black Wall Street when the whites attacked them. And if you watch the recent HBO series Watchmen, the great performances in that by so I say Regina King, you know, who played the superhero who kind of lead that insurrection. You see that comes with her grandfather, Louis Gossett, comes into the Black Wall Street debacle, the great pogrom of 1919. That all ties back to them creating this as basically a Bantustan, to use South African language, for the Native Americans and whoever blacks are with them. All right, let's go very quickly. We're going to wind this to a close for today. Here's framing question 4. Black Movements in America, Cedric Robinson. Chapter 4, we had that. The Civil War and its aftermath. Here's another one. One of the how to read sessions we had to postpone. And if you're on Sankopa's channel watching this, you know that one of the videos you'll have access to is the how to read Amiri Baraka. We had how to read Du Bois, and we were debating which books to use. Souls of Black Folk, we thought maybe the second one to use would be Black Reconstruction in America, because he wrote so much. Read this book if you want to understand this period, the Civil War and its aftermath. Robinson talks about opposing objectives, accumulation versus liberty. Accumulation, that's the one you're going to read about. They want territory, right? This is why you have to destroy the South, Sherman's March to the Sea. This is why you got to subdue them politically. That's Lincoln's philosophy. That's why you have to figure out how to do that. Versus liberty. Who wants liberty? We do. And it's not coming from listening to Father Abraham. It's coming from, I don't want to be a slave. And then you have the military leaders in the North telling Lincoln how to win the war. There's a song called Give Us a Flag that black people used to sing in the Army. And it starts with Fremont told them how, when the war had just begun, how to save the Union and the way it should be run. But, as it was sung, old Kentucky had its doubts and A.B. had his fears. Now they call for the help of the colored volunteers. Meaning what? Abraham Lincoln said, if I'm to win this war, I want to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. What does that mean? Kentucky's a border state. You don't want to lose any more states. Fremont told them, get these Africans the guns, this war is over. Lincoln said, I can't really, man, they'll leave if I tell them no. Okay, fine. Guess what? Now you're getting your ass beat. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. Guess what? They have a chance to win the war. For the South to win the war, they don't have to take New York City. They just got to keep you out of the South. And meanwhile, France and England and them are sitting it out saying, well, we can trade stuff out of Charleston and New Orleans. We ain't got to ship out of New York. We wait to see who's going to win this war. So they're over there. There's a new scholarship on the diplomats they sent, the Confederates sent to Paris to negotiate this. Lincoln is going to try to sit it out. But then when they start losing, okay, now, and guess what? Black people didn't wait. They're going to start fighting the minute. This is chapter 3 or 4 of Black Reconstruction in America, book almost 700 pages. He writes a chapter, Du Bois, called The General Strike. You know what damaged the Confederates from the jump? Black people stopped working. Now you collapse the Southern economy. Then some of these Negroes picked up guns. Oh my God. Who won the war? Black people freed themselves. I'm putting something on a piece of paper. Let's be very clear. Y'all you Lincoln Negroes that love Lincoln so much, go read Laurent Bennett, Forced into Glory. And stop thinking that the Emancipation Proclamation freed anybody. Lincoln didn't even free the people he could. The only one that got somewhere was the Emancipated Proclamation, and that was Washington, D.C., and they paid them white people. The Blacks' War, that's what Robinson's writing about. He's fighting, we're fighting everyone. White Reconstruction and Black Deconstruction. This is what I talked about earlier. You've got voter suppression taking place during the Reconstruction period. If you want to see that, meaning what? The Civil War is over 1865. In 1865, you have a period. Now, Lincoln gets killed in April 1865. Johnson comes in, gives territory back to the slave masters, sells off the land they promised to the black people. But there is a radical Reconstruction that bursts forth. Charles Sumner and all them, Thaddeus Stevens, all these cats. So they're going to push for black rights. They're all Republicans, by the way, because the Republican Party was the party of business, founded in the 1850s, and it's bad for business, this war. So when the Republicans tell you today, Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, we were for black people. No, that you know, we're going to talk about that frame of question 5. Y'all different than these people. These people were always pro-business, as were you, but for them, slavery was bad for business, which is why in the South, they pushed for black people to have these voting rights, black men. Black men became the Republican Party, and that's what put into place black elected officials. But from the beginning in Louisiana and Tennessee, from the beginning in Georgia, where Henry Neal Turner was, or all the way over to North Carolina, you had white reactionaries fighting the lost cause, as they call it in Civil War scholarship. They're fighting against that. So you got voter suppression that begins from the beginning. By the time you get to, in the Ndir period that Rayford Logan is talking about, by the time you get to the end of Reconstruction, they have suppressed much of the black vote. And I was telling y'all a little bit about that earlier when we were talking about H. Leon Prather in North Carolina, places like that. All right, 1860 to the present. The formation of the modern U.S. state. I think this is where we will get through this one and maybe pause for today. And then we'll do one more on framing question 4, because this gets us into the conversation. We haven't even touched on Africa. The formation of the U.S. state. From 1860 to 1865, you have the U.S. Civil War. Robinson begins this on page, those of you in the class, page 67. The secession of slave states, which led to the Civil War between the Union and the Confederate forces, were commenced by South Carolina in December 1860. John C. Calhoun. We'll talk about Calhoun another time. There's so many stories. Only seemingly paradoxical, it was this Civil War that dismembered the slave regime. Then he goes on to talk about how the other ones come in March of 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, in fraternity with South Carolina, had initiated the Confederate States of America in April when Lincoln mobilized Union troops to put down the rebellion. And one of the first groups of Union troops he sent out was not south but north to Baltimore, where they had deep Confederate sympathies. By the way, those of you who know the flag of Maryland, yellow and black, that is a holdover in part from its early roots in Catholicism. You read chapter 1 of Cedric Robinson, he tell you about George Calvert, also known Lord Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore. So you know it's a kind of a haven for Catholics. Maryland was, but that red in it. There's been some more recent scholarship. In fact, a recent edition of Maryland Magazine talks about this, saying that red in it is a gesture toward the Confederate battle flag, because they had Confederate sympathies in Maryland. You know, that's a slave state. You know, Harriet Tubman was operating off the eastern shore of Maryland. She's not in Mississippi. So he goes on to say that in April, when Lincoln mobilized Union troops to put down the rebellion, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy. Goes on how it says the border states stayed with the Union: Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. That's why he had to send some troops to Baltimore, because they technically in the Union, but they slave sympathetic. So you got the war. The war ends. Then you got Reconstruction, 1865 to 76. We talk about the election of Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden, the governors of Ohio and New York, contesting for the presidency in 1876. 1877 to 1901, the Reconciliation period. What I call the Reconciliation period, Rayford Logan called the Nadirs. We talked about the low point, but reconciliation, that's a gesture toward the work of David Blight and others. If you read David Blight's book, Race and Reunion, his massive new book, prize-winning book on Frederick Douglass, you see. And David Blight, of course, isn't the only one writing about this. Again, Rayford Logan precedes him by many years. Between Rayford Logan and David Blight, you got cats like Sidney Wilhelm, who wrote Who Needs the Negro, which in some ways is a kind of a gloss between some of what Rayford Logan is writing about. And then in the distant future, by a couple of decades, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. If you go back in time, next after him, after Sidney Wilhelm, you have the great Sharshy McIntyre. Those of you interested in black women scholarship, #cite black women, cite her book, Criminalizing a Race, which in many ways lays down the foundation for what some of the things that Michelle Alexander will write about later. So you have during this period, the South basically reconciles with the North. As long as we can do business, we're okay. What about the blacks? You do what you want. That's what Cedric Robinson, that's what Derek Bell is talking about in terms of the involuntary sacrifice, which requires a second Reconstruction. It's the Civil War Acts. 13th Amendment abolishes enslavement unless if you commit a crime. You know, when you look at the documentary 13, Ava DuVernay. 14th Amendment equal protection under the law, due process under the law, the so-called kind of Citizenship Amendment. Why are you dealing with this? Because the 14th Amendment is designed in some ways to cure the argument that Roger Taney is making in Dred Scott about these natures of citizenship. Except every legal document you see pled that argues a civil rights violation based in citizenship has to still plead that there's a violation of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment. Why? Because they say the 5th Amendment is for the United States and the 14th Amendment makes the 5th Amendment apply to the states. So still, Taney's concept is still hardwired into this because the United States of America is not one state. It's 50 different entities, including the colonies, more than 50, and this larger concept. But the second Reconstruction, finally, the 15th Amendment, of course, extends the right to vote, first to black men. Then, of course, the 19th Amendment assures it to women. But to black women, well, it's hard to say because you get a second Reconstruction, which is pursuant to the things that have already been written in the Constitution, but then you got to litigate this stuff in court and finally get out into the streets to join the courts to say, make these Civil War amendments into laws that are enforced. That's where you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's pursuant to the 15th Amendment in many ways. That's why you get the Civil Rights Act of 1864. That's pursuant in many ways to the 14th Amendment. That's why you get the Fair Housing Act of 1968. How does it tie to framing question 4? How did Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? Go back to your syllabus, Howard students. Those of you watching, go back to the previous video. That framing question language in the syllabus, which talks about the fact that after enslavement, these European colonies now become states, turn to debt, peonage, and other forms of oppression to trap the Africans in there into the system that continues in a different way. While their European parents, the European states, now go into Africa, Asia, other places to reduce them to colonialism if they can. And what the Africans in all of these places do is they continue to resist alongside other people, and then ultimately they become aware of each other's resistance, and they use that resistance to form not only bonds of identity, bonds of solidarity, but to inform their local resistance. So by the time you get to the second Reconstruction in this country, again, the work of Carol Anderson, as I mentioned, the work of Gerald Horne, as I mentioned, the work of so many others who say it is the gesture toward global solidarity that forces the domestic governance, the domestic social structure, rather, the domestic polity, the federal government, for example, to accelerate its efforts to make concessions to the black populations. Brown versus Board of Education isn't just a gesture of goodwill. No matter how many documentaries or movies you make to make this thing, this is about the goodwill of, glorious people who see the light. No, part of this is these African people in the United States are looking beyond national boundaries. They've been through World War I now. They've been through the Spanish-Cuban-Spanish War, which becomes the Spanish-American War now. They've been through World War II now. They come back, now you got problems. After World War I, Black Wall Street gets torched. The so-called Red Summer of 1919. James Weldon Johnson talking about that. You get to World War II, you come back and say, no, we ain't going for this okey-yoke again. We're going in with what they call the double victory. Howard students read about that in chapter 4. What do you see in chapter 4? The Civil War and its aftermath. And then chapter 5, the Ndir and its aftermath. These Africans are learning every time they engage internationally, they come back domestically a little wiser on how to work going forward. The Library of Congress had a great exhibit on World War I. The Museum of African American History and Culture has a great one right now on World War I when it reopens. Shout out to my dear friends at the museum. Kinshasa Conwell and all them, Deidre Cross in the education department. And of course, we went down because they published a book, We Return Fighting, from World War I. Very good brother, Dr. Koreski Salters, who is over one of the museums in Illinois, which is now on shelter in place. When that's lifted, I want y'all to go to his museum and look up Kowalski Salters, who edited this book, a military historian, PhD, also retired Army officer, who put together this book. And you see, after World War I, that's the period of Ada Wells. That's the period of Mary Church Terrell. That's the period of Du Bois and them talking, we come back fighting. World War II, they come back, double victory. This is the Pittsburgh Courier. They're saying, we've seen the world. We know we're connected beyond this. And what you see in this period, Africans conceiving of unity, it shifts the domestic policymakers. You've got to offer Brown versus Board of Education. Why? Because the Soviet Union and China are out there telling people the United States is racist as hell. And guess what? The United States is racist as hell.